He was the most powerful man in the city. She didn't even know his name, and that was exactly what changed everything. A billionaire. A woman in a faded caregiver uniform crying alone in a dark parking lot. No one saw her, except him. And when he chose to stop, neither of them could have known that one small act of decency would pull them into a storm the entire world would watch. This is their story. Stay until the end, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The rain had been threatening all evening. By the time Landon Hayes stepped out of the Meridian Tower's glass lobby, the sky had made good on its threat. A cold drizzle swept across downtown Chicago in thin, diagonal sheets, the kind that didn't soak you all at once, but crept through your collar and settled into your bones before you noticed. He stood at the top of the steps for a moment, loosening his tie with 2 fingers, letting the damp air hit his face. Behind him, 22 floors of his company hummed with the quiet machinery of money. 1,200 employees, 4 subsidiaries, a healthcare empire that had been featured on the cover of Forbes twice in the past 3 years. Landon Hayes, CEO of Hayes Medical Group, the man who had restructured senior care funding across 3 states, who had shaken hands with senators, who had been described in one profile as the rare billionaire with a conscience. He didn't feel like a man with a conscience tonight. He felt tired, just tired. His driver, Marcus, had the black SUV idling at the curb with the precision of a man who had been doing this for 6 years and understood that Landon's moods after board meetings were best navigated with silence and a steady route home. Landon pulled on his coat and started down the steps, nodding once to Marcus without breaking stride. "How'd it go?" Marcus asked, opening the rear door. "Fine," Landon said, which meant it hadn't. The meeting had run 2 hours over schedule, 12 people around a glass conference table, PowerPoint slides full of metrics that Landon knew how to read before the presenter finished the first sentence. Revenue projections, operating margins, allocation percentages, the language of people who manage numbers for a living, people who were very good at making human beings disappear behind spreadsheet rows. The item that had kept them there past 9 o'clock was a proposal from the board's financial advisory team, a restructuring plan that would phase out 3 low-margin programs within the Hayes Medical Group portfolio. Community care coordination, mobile health visits for homebound seniors, a partnership subsidy program for smaller independent care facilities. Together, the 3 programs served roughly 4,100 people. "Their philanthropic liabilities," said Gerald Whitmore, the head of investor relations, a man with the kind of confidence that came from never having personally experienced inconvenience. "We took them on as goodwill initiatives 5 years ago. They've served their purpose optics-wise, but the numbers simply don't justify continued investment at this level." 4,100 people, Landon said quietly, the majority of whom are served by county programs that could absorb county programs that have a 14-month waiting list. A pause. Gerald adjusted his cufflinks. "Landon, we're not a charity. I know what we are." He'd tabled the vote, told them he needed more time to review the full impact assessment, felt 12 pairs of eyes exchange glances around the table, the particular look of people who believed a decision had already been made and were waiting for the principal to catch up. In the SUV, Landon leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. The windshield wipers kept a steady rhythm. Chicago slid past in wet amber and neon. "We're not a charity." No. But he remembered very clearly what it looked like when systems failed people. He remembered a hospital room, a hand he couldn't hold tightly enough, the particular silence of monitors when they stop. He didn't think about his wife often anymore. 3 years had a way of building scar tissue over the sharpest things. But nights like this, with decisions like that sitting in his chest, Elena came back to him without warning. "Marcus," he said, "take me to Collier Street." "The long way?" "Yeah." He didn't intend to stop anywhere. Collier Street was just a route, a 2-mile stretch of mid-range restaurants and boutique storefronts that he'd driven 100 times when he didn't want to go directly home to an apartment that, for all its square footage and views of Lake Michigan, had a particular silence in the evening that he'd never quite figured out how to fill. His daughter, Mia, was at her grandmother's tonight. 6 years old, with Elena's dark eyes and Landon's stubborn streak, she would be asleep by now, probably with 3 stuffed animals arranged in a specific order that only she understood and that she'd explained to him 4 times with great patience. He missed her the way you miss someone even when they're only 12 miles away. It wasn't absence, and it was something closer to the awareness of how much of his life had become about protecting something small and irreplaceable. The SUV slowed for a red light at the corner of Collier and Marsh. That was when Landon saw her. She was standing in the parking lot of Bianchi's, a family Italian place with a striped green awning and a sign in the window advertising Tuesday night prefix. And she was not having a good night. He could see that much through the rain-streaked window. She had her back half turned to the street, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her head bowed. She was wearing a pale blue uniform, the kind caregivers wore, slightly rumpled, with a lanyard still clipped to the breast pocket. She was crying. Quietly, carefully, the way people cry when they've decided they're going to get through it without making a scene. Nobody was paying her any attention. 3 other cars were pulling out of the lot. A couple under a shared umbrella walked past without looking up. The light turned green. Marcus didn't move. Landon realized after a moment that Marcus was watching him in the rearview mirror. "Pull over," Landon said. He didn't know what he was going to say. He got out of the SUV without an umbrella. He'd left it in the office, and walked across the wet asphalt with his coat collar up and his hands in his pockets, which was probably not the most approachable presentation. He was aware, as he crossed the lot, that he was a 6'1" man in a $1,500 coat walking toward a woman who was alone at night, and he slowed his pace and kept his distance and tried to look like someone with benign intentions, which he was, but which was admittedly difficult to communicate in a parking lot. "Hey," he said. "Sorry, I don't mean to—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Are you all right?" She turned around fast. Her eyes were red at the edges, her cheeks wet from the rain or from crying, or both. She was maybe 30, maybe a little younger, with dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail that had mostly given up by this point in the evening. She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has already had a bad night and is now calculating whether this development makes it worse. "I'm fine," she said, reflexively, the way people say it when they're not. "Okay," Landon said. "You don't have to be. Fine, I mean." She blinked. "What?" I saw you from the car and I thought—" He exhaled. This was going poorly. "Do you need a ride somewhere? Or I can just leave. That's also a completely reasonable option." She stared at him for a second. Then something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, but curiosity. "You always stop in parking lots for strangers?" "First time, actually." "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because you looked like you were having the kind of night where it might help if someone noticed." She looked away, pressed her lips together. The rain was getting heavier now, and she had no umbrella either, and there was a kind of shared absurdity to 2 people standing in an increasingly wet parking lot having this conversation that seemed to land on both of them at the same time. "My date left," she said finally. Not like she was confiding in him. More like she was just stating a fact, the way you'd report weather. "Before we even sat down, he took one look at my—" She gestured at her uniform. "At this, and decided he had somewhere else to be." Landon looked at the uniform, then at her face. "His loss," he said, which was something people said, he knew, but he meant it in a very specific, non-generic way that he wasn't sure how to communicate, so he didn't try. "That's a nice thing to say." "It's a true thing." He paused. "I was going to get dinner. The place on the corner, Harlow's, do you know it? They have a decent menu, and the lighting's not aggressive." He watched her face. "I'm not hitting on you. I'm aware of how this sounds. But I genuinely was about to eat alone, and if you haven't eaten, and if you don't have somewhere to be, I thought, maybe we could both have a less miserable Tuesday." She studied him, took in the coat, the careful distance he was keeping, the rain flattening his hair because he hadn't thought to bring an umbrella, which for some reason seemed to settle something for her. "I don't know you," she said. "No, my name's Landon." "Sophie," she said. A beat. Sophie Bennett. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it. Her grip was firm and her hand was cold. Okay, Landon, she said. One dinner, and then I'm going to go home and call my mother and try to salvage the rest of this night. Deal, he said. Bassa begin. Harlow's was the kind of restaurant that had been there for 20 years and hadn't tried very hard to update anything, which was either a flaw or a feature, depending on who you asked. Landon asked. Dark wood paneling, leather booths worn soft with use, a bar along one wall where 3 people sat with their drinks, and the quiet company of the television overhead. The hostess, a woman in her 40s named Diane, her name tag said, gave Landon a polite once-over and gave Sophie a slightly longer one, taking in the uniform, before her expression settled into professional warmth. They were seated in a corner booth. Sophie sat down and immediately reached for the menu with both hands, like something to hold on to. You can ask me about it, she said, without looking up. Everyone does. Ask you about what? The uniform. Why I'm still wearing it at 9:30 at night. Why I went on a date dressed like this. You worked a long shift, Landon said. He picked up his own menu. And you probably didn't have time to go home and change before you had to be there, and the date was supposed to not care about it. She lowered her menu slowly. How do you know that? Guess. She set the menu down, looked at him with something that wasn't quite suspicion anymore. What do you do, Landon? Healthcare, he said, which was true. Like, you work in a hospital? Not exactly. I'm on the administrative side of things. Also true. So you sit in meetings all day and argue about budget allocations? He laughed, genuine, short, surprised out of him. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Sounds exhausting. It is. He meant that more than she knew. What about you? Where do you work? And that was when she started talking. He hadn't expected her to be funny. He didn't know what he'd expected. Someone quieter, maybe, or more careful with a stranger. But Sophie Bennett had apparently reached a point in her evening where the usual social defenses had been worn down, and what was left was someone who talked like she thought, which was quickly and with a dark, dry humor that kept catching him off guard. She worked at Maplewood Gardens, a senior care facility in the Northbrook area, the kind of place that operated on a budget that required staff to be creative and administrators to be resourceful, and the people living there to be patient, which most of them were, because by the time you're 82 and your knees don't work and half your friends are gone, patience becomes a survival skill. Mr. Delgado, she said, telling him about one of her residents with the particular affection of someone who's been exasperated by and devoted to a person simultaneously, is 86 years old, and he has very specific opinions about the temperature of his morning oatmeal. Not warm, not hot. Exactly the temperature of something that has been sitting out for 4 minutes. He times me. With a watch? With a stopwatch, Sophie said. He ordered it online. His granddaughter helped him set it up. She shook her head, but she was smiling. And the thing is, he's right. Every time. When I get it exactly right, he just nods like I've met baseline human expectations. When I'm off by a minute, he sighs like I've personally disappointed him. Do you adjust your routine for him? Of course I do. I leave it out for exactly 4 minutes now. She picked up her water glass. He doesn't know that. He thinks he's training me. She paused. He is training me, but he doesn't need to know that. Landon looked at her. How long have you been there? 4 years. She set the glass down. Started as part-time when my mom started showing signs of memory issues. Needed something with flexible hours and health benefits. And the director, Linda, she works with me on scheduling. She said this with genuine gratitude. The gratitude of someone who's learned not to take flexible scheduling for granted. It's not a job I planned for, but the people are... She stopped. They're real, you know. The residents, they're not patients to manage. They're people with entire histories. She looked slightly self-conscious. That sounds like something off a greeting card. No, Landon said. It doesn't. She glanced up at him. He was watching her with an attention she hadn't expected. Not polite attention, the kind you gave someone when you were waiting for your turn to speak. but actual attention. The kind that made you realize you'd been used to the other kind for a long time. "What?" she said. "Nothing. Keep going." "I'm talking too much." "You're really not." The food arrived. She'd ordered pasta. Something simple, something she'd pointed to without much deliberation, like someone who eats functionally rather than as an experience. Landon had ordered the same thing, mostly because it had been the first item that looked like actual food, and he was tired of meals that came with descriptions requiring knowledge of culinary terminology. They ate. Sophie told him about her mother, Margaret, early-stage dementia, currently stable, but with the unpredictability that currently stable always carried. "She has good days and hard days," Sophie said. "On the good days, she's exactly herself. She talks about my dad who died 8 years ago, like he just left for work this morning. And she considered, I used to correct her. When she'd talk about him in present tense, I thought it was the right thing to do. Her therapist helped me understand that it wasn't. What changed? She'd get upset. Every time I corrected her, I was making her experience the loss again, fresh every time." Sophie moved a piece of penne around her plate. "So now I go with her. She asks where he is, I say he'll be back later, and she nods and moves on, and she's okay." A pause. "It feels like lying. I know it isn't, but it feels like it." Landon was quiet for a moment. "My daughter asks about her mother sometimes," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out like something that had been waiting. "She's 6. My wife, Elena, she passed away 3 years ago, breast cancer." He looked down at his plate. "Mia knows her mother died. We've had that conversation, very carefully, more times than I want to count. But sometimes she asks questions like she's trying to build a picture of someone she barely remembers. And I tell her things. I tell her Elena liked old movies and always burned the first batch of anything she baked and could fall asleep in a moving car in under 4 minutes." He paused. "I don't know if I'm doing it right." "You never know if you're doing it right." Sophie was watching him. "You're doing it right," she said. "The fact that you're asking the question means you're doing it right." He looked up. She held his gaze, and there was something in her expression. Not pity, not the careful sympathy that people often performed around widowed fathers, something more direct than that. Like she was just saying a thing she believed. "Sorry," she said. "I don't know why I said that with such certainty." "Don't be sorry," he said. "I needed to hear it said with certainty." They were on coffee by the time the restaurant had mostly emptied. Diane had refreshed their cups twice without being asked and had, at some point, made a quiet decision to let the booth run long. Sophie was telling him about Mrs. Okafor, another resident at Maplewood, 84, former English literature professor at Northwestern, who still had strong opinions about punctuation and had recently, during an evening reading group Sophie facilitated, stopped in the middle of a Toni Morrison passage to correct Sophie's emphasis on a particular sentence. "She wasn't wrong," Sophie said. "She was absolutely correct, and she was also very satisfied with herself." "Good teacher," Landon said. "The best kind. The ones who are still right, even when they're difficult." Sophie smiled, a real smile, the kind that had been absent when he'd found her in the parking lot. "I actually started reading more because of her. She loans me books, writes little notes in the margins in pencil, real light pencil, so it can be erased. She says she doesn't want to ruin the book for the next person, but the notes are always brilliant, and I told her that, and she said, then the next person will simply have to develop better interpretive skills." Landon laughed. Sophie watched him laugh, and something happened in her expression, a small contraction, almost invisible, like she'd caught herself. "What?" he said. "Nothing. It's just—" She looked away, then back. "You're easier to talk to than I expected." "Is that a compliment or a concern?" "Bit of both." She glanced at her phone, which had been face down on the table all evening. "I should check on my mom. She's home with her neighbor. Mrs. Yuen watches her on Tuesday evening, so I can have—" She gestured vaguely. "Theoretically a life outside of caregiving. How often does that happen?" Tonight was supposed to be it for the month. She picked up her phone. Landon watched her expression change as she looked at the screen. A quick sequence of micro-expressions, each one slightly worse than the last. "What is it?" "Mrs. Yuen texted," Sophie said, 40 minutes ago. Her voice had gone careful and controlled, the voice of someone managing a developing situation. "My mom is... she's not there. She went outside and Mrs. Yuen didn't notice right away, and she's been looking for 20 minutes and..." She was already standing, grabbing her jacket, her hands moving with the focused efficiency of someone who had practiced emergency responses. "I have to go," she said. "I'll help you look." She stopped, looked at him. You don't have to do that. You don't even know us." "I know where to start looking," he said. "I have a car outside, and 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. He stood up. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." Sophie looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant was quiet around them. Rain still traced the windows. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." Oh. What followed was 3 hours that Landon would remember, later, as among the most clarifying of his life, which was not a thing he could have explained to anyone without sounding strange, but which was simply true. Margaret Bennett was 63 years old, and in a photo on Sophie's phone, she looked like a woman who had once been described as formidable and still carried the structural evidence of it: good cheekbones, a particular set to the jaw. Early-stage dementia had not, as Sophie explained in the car, taken her to a place of confusion most of the time. More often, it took her to a place of certainty. Absolute confidence in a reality that was slightly displaced from the current one. She might believe she was walking to a store that had closed years ago. She might be looking for a person who was no longer there. She might be going to the old house, Sophie said. She was in the front seat, not the back, which had been her choice, and she was directing Landon through the city with the taut focus of someone suppressing fear by converting it to logistics. They sold it 7 years ago, but sometimes she thinks she lives there. Turn left here. Marcus turned left without a word. Landon was on the phone with the non-emergency police line, filing a report, giving Margaret's description, age, medical history. The dispatcher was competent and steady and told him officers would be in the area. Sophie was texting Mrs. Yuen updates, calling 2 of her mother's friends, calling her uncle, who lived 40 minutes north. The old neighborhood was in Lincoln Square, narrower streets, older trees, 2 flats with deep front porches. Sophie knew it from years of childhood geography, and she directed them through it with the confident precision of someone navigating from memory. She used to walk to the park every morning, Sophie said. Dad would go with her. They had a bench they liked. It's stupid. Benches in public parks don't belong to anyone, but what park? Rosen Park, half a mile from the old house. Marcus? Landon said. Already turning, Marcus said. Rosen Park had path lighting that threw long yellow circles on the wet grass. It was after 11 now, and the park was empty, and the rain had stopped but left everything gleaming, and when the headlights swept the main path, Landon saw the figure on the bench before Sophie did. There, he said. Sophie was out of the car before it had fully stopped, which was the kind of thing you did when the fear you'd been converting to logistics suddenly had nowhere left to go. Landon followed at a distance, far enough to give them space, close enough in case anything was needed. Margaret Bennett was sitting on a bench with a canvas shopping bag in her lap, wearing a cardigan over her nightclothes. She did not appear distressed. She appeared to be waiting for someone. Her hair was slightly damp, and her shoes, house slippers, the kind with the foam sole, were wet through. Mom, Sophie said. Her voice was not the controlled voice she'd used in the car. It was a different voice entirely. Mom, I've been... Sophie... Margaret looked up, completely calm. I was wondering when you'd get here. I've been waiting. Sophie crouched in front of the bench and took her mother's hands, and the entire shape of her. The set of her shoulders, the line of her back, changed in the way that bodies change when the thing they've been braced for doesn't happen. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than relief. I'm here, Sophie said. I'm right here. Your father's late, Margaret said. He's always late from the market. She patted Sophie's hand. We'll give him a few more minutes. Sophie's breath caught, just barely. Then, of course, she said. He'll be here soon. Landon stood back 30 feet away, under the dripping overhang of a park tree, and watched Sophie Bennett hold her mother's hands and agree that her father would be there soon, and something happened in his chest that he didn't have clean language for. He'd spent 12 hours fighting about profit margins. He'd spent 3 years measuring everything against an absence. He'd been featured in 4 magazine profiles and described as insightful and visionary and a disruptive force in American healthcare. He was watching a woman in a wet caregiver uniform kneel on wet ground in a park at 11 o'clock at night, keeping her voice steady and her face quiet, so her mother's last good minutes of the evening would be peaceful instead of frightening. He thought about Gerald Whitmore. They've served their purpose optics-wise. He thought about 4,100 people disappearing behind a spreadsheet row. He stood in the rain-wet dark and he understood something. Clearly, completely, the way you understand things when they arrive through the body instead of the mind. They got Margaret home at 11:30. Mrs. Ewan was waiting on the steps, distressed and apologetic, and Sophie managed her with the same quiet competence she managed everything. No anger, no blame, just, it's okay, she's safe, thank you for staying. Landon stayed with the car while Sophie got her mother settled. Marcus had found a 24-hour coffee place 2 blocks over and procured 2 cups without being asked, which was one of the many reasons Landon had kept him on for 6 years. Sophie came back out 20 minutes later. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 3 hours in a sustained low-level emergency and was now, in the absence of crisis, suddenly aware of how much she was carrying. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps when she saw him still there. "You waited," she said. "I wanted to make sure she was okay." Sophie came down the steps and took the cup he held out. She wrapped both hands around it and looked at the street for a long moment. "She thinks my dad is coming back from the grocery store," she said. "She's going to fall asleep waiting for him. I'll check on her in an hour and she'll be fine." A pause. "She's been doing that more often, the displacement, believing she's in a time before he died." "Does it scare you?" "Everything about it scares me," Sophie said. "I just don't have the luxury of acting scared." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, which somehow made it more difficult to hear than if she'd said it with the other thing. Landon looked at his coffee. "Thank you," he said. She glanced at him. "For what?" "For having dinner with me. For—" He paused. "For the conversation. I needed it." Sophie looked at him with a directness that he'd noticed all evening. The quality of her attention, the absence of performance in it. "You're a strange man, Landon," she said. "I've been told. I mean that as a compliment. I'm taking it as one." She almost smiled. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Sophie." She went back inside. Landon stood on the sidewalk in the cooling night air for a moment before getting into the car. Marcus glanced at him in the rear view as he pulled away. "How was dinner?" "Unexpected," Landon said. Marcus nodded slowly. "Usually the best kind." He didn't sleep well that night, not because anything troubled him, exactly, more because his mind had been given something new to work with and wasn't willing to set it down. He kept thinking about the park bench, about Margaret Bennett saying we'll give him a few more minutes with the perfect patience of someone who had no idea she was waiting for a ghost, about Sophie saying he'll be here soon without hesitation, the ability to carry difficult things without making them someone else's problem. He had a daughter, a company, a series of decisions in front of him that would define, one way or another, the kind of institution he was building. He had a board meeting in 10 days, and a proposal that was going to come back to the table, and a room full of people who were very good at making 4,100 human lives look like a liability. He didn't know Sophie Bennett's last name for 4 minutes before she told him. He didn't know her salary, or her apartment, or anything about her life beyond the things she'd shared over pasta and 2 cups of coffee. He knew she left oatmeal to cool for exactly 4 minutes because an 86-year-old man had taught her his system. He knew she'd started reading more because a retired literature professor wrote small penciled notes in the margins of loaned books. He knew that when the worst thing she could imagine happened, she didn't fall apart. She got in the car and started directing. He lay in the dark of his apartment for a long time, listening to the city, thinking about the way she'd said, "I just don't have the luxury of acting scared." At 2 in the morning, He picked up his phone and sent an email to his director of research. Subject line: Full Impact Assessment, Care Programs. Need it by Friday. Then he put the phone down and looked at the ceiling. He had no idea if he'd see Sophie Bennett again. He thought there was a reasonable chance he wouldn't. She was a practical woman. He was a stranger who had shown up in a parking lot, but the evening had done something, shifted something, given 4,100 numbers a face. Not just one face, but the kind of face that came attached to Mr. Delgado's stopwatch, and Mrs. Okafor's margin notes, and the coffee that had to cool for exactly 4 minutes. He closed his eyes. Outside, Chicago went on with the particular restlessness of a city that never fully slept, indifferent and alive, the wet streets carrying whatever light they could find. He would see her again. He just didn't know yet that by the time he did, everything would be different. 3 days passed before Landon thought about reaching out. Then 4. Then a week. It wasn't hesitation, exactly. Or maybe it was, but the kind with reasons attached to it. He had the impact assessment to review. He had Mia's parent-teacher conference on Thursday, which ran long because Mia had apparently told her first-grade class that butterflies were overrated, and her teacher, a kind woman named Ms. Park, wanted to discuss whether this reflected an emotional state worth exploring. It did not. It reflected the fact that Mia had recently become obsessed with beetles and was conducting a passionate, one-sided campaign to make people appreciate them more. She's very confident in her opinions, Ms. Park said, with the carefully neutral tone of someone who had chosen her words for 15 minutes before the meeting. She gets that from her mother, Landon said. He'd meant it as an explanation. The moment it came out, it felt like both an explanation and a grief, which was a combination he was used to by now, and which still sometimes caught him sideways. Miss Park softened slightly. She's doing beautifully, she said. The beetle thing is fine. We're working on diplomatic framing. On the drive home with Mia, who was buckled into the back seat explaining, unprompted, the structural advantages of the scarab beetle's exoskeleton, Landon thought about Sophie's voice when she'd said, "I just don't have the luxury of acting scared." He thought about the way she'd stayed on the wet ground in the park, keeping her mother calm, keeping her voice even. He thought about how different that was from the kind of strength people in his world performed, which was loud and required an audience. He got her number through the restaurant. He wasn't proud of how he did it. He'd gone back to Harlow's the following Saturday and spoken to Diane, who had seen him and Sophie leave together and had made reasonable assumptions about the situation and confirmed carefully that the woman he was asking about had in fact mentioned working at Maplewood Gardens. From there, it was a 10-second search to get the facility's number and another conversation to learn from a warmly unhelpful front desk person that they could not give out employee contact information. Which was correct, which he respected. He sent flowers instead. To Maplewood Gardens, attention Sophie Bennett. No card with his name, so just a note that read, "Hope your mom is doing well." The parking lot stranger. He didn't know if that was charming or strange. He suspected it was probably both. Sophie called him 2 days later. He was in the middle of a call with the lead attorney on the care program restructuring and had to let it go to voicemail, and then spent 11 minutes doing a very poor job of listening to his attorney while reading Sophie's message twice. This was either the most thoughtful thing anyone's ever done or mildly alarming. "I'm choosing thoughtful. Mom is okay. She had a good week, thank you. Sophie." He texted back, "Glad to hear it. I owe you a better Tuesday." She wrote back, "You don't owe me anything." He wrote, "I know, I'd still like one." There was a pause of about 4 hours, long enough that he assumed the conversation was over. Then, "I'm off Saturday afternoon." That was how it started. Not with drama, not with a declaration, with a Saturday afternoon and 2 people who had already used up most of their pretense in a parking lot in a park at 11 o'clock at night. They met at a farmer's market on the north side because Sophie mentioned in their first real text exchange that her mother liked a particular kind of apple that was only available at one vendor there in the fall, and Landon had suggested meeting close to wherever she already needed to be, which Sophie had noticed and commented on, which had led to a conversation about how most people suggested meeting places based on their own convenience and called it a compromise. "My ex did that," Sophie said. They were walking the market at the unhurried pace of a Saturday that had nowhere specific to be. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder that was already carrying apples, a bunch of kale she'd bought out of what seemed like obligation, and a jar of local honey. He'd say, "Let's compromise," and then suggest exactly what he wanted but present it as a negotiation. What happened to him? He decided he wanted to live in Austin. I decided I wanted to stay here with my mother. She shrugged. It was the shrug of someone who had processed a decision a long time ago. That was 2 years ago. It was the right call for both of us, but it didn't feel like it at the time. When did it start feeling like it? She thought about it. Gradually, she said. Then all at once. Landon looked at her. That's a Hemingway line. Mrs. Okafor's been lending me Hemingway. She glanced at the apple vendor. Hang on. He watched her negotiate with the vendor. A round, enthusiastic man named Pete, who clearly knew her and launched into a detailed account of this year's Honeycrisp crop before she could get a word in. She listened patiently, asked one question that Pete clearly found gratifying, and walked away with 2 bags of apples and a coupon for next week. He gave me a coupon, she said, slightly bewildered. You listened to him talk about apples for 4 minutes, Landon said. People will give you things for that. I didn't do it for the coupon. I know. That's why it worked. She looked at him with the particular expression she'd started making around him. Slightly narrowed eyes, like she was assessing whether he was as perceptive as he sometimes seemed or if he was performing it. He wasn't performing it. He genuinely found her interesting, which was a thing that happened to him less often than people assumed, given how many interesting people he was professionally surrounded by. They had lunch at a Thai place 2 blocks from the market. It was the kind of restaurant that had 6 tables and a handwritten menu and a woman in the kitchen who was clearly running the whole operation and had opinions about how long things should cook that she did not compromise on. Sophie had been there before. She ordered for both of them with the confidence of someone who knew the menu, glancing at him only to check if he had any allergies. He didn't. You're not bothered by someone else ordering for you? She asked. Should I be? A lot of people are. Especially, she stopped. Especially what? Especially men who are used to being in charge, she said. Direct. Not apologetic about it. He considered it honestly. I think there's a difference between being in charge and needing to be in control, he said. I've got one. I've worked on having less of the other. Which one have you got? I have a lot of opinions about healthcare policy and I run 17 miles a week, he said. You figure it out. She laughed. It was the first full laugh he'd heard from her, unguarded and a little surprised, like she'd been caught off guard by her own amusement. It changed her face completely, and he stored the image of it the way you stored things you didn't want to misplace. Over lunch, she told him more about her week. One of her residents, a woman named Helen, had turned 89 and the family had thrown her a party in the common room. And Helen had been perfectly delightful about it publicly, and had told Sophie privately, afterward, that she'd only wanted a quiet dinner and the family never listened. Sophie had stayed late to bring her a piece of the cake she'd actually wanted. Chocolate, not the vanilla the family had ordered because it photographed better. It photographed better? Landon said. They were posting it on Instagram. Sophie's voice was entirely neutral. The neutrality of someone who had decided judgment was not productive, but found it challenging. Did Helen get her chocolate cake? She did, and we watched an old movie on my laptop while she ate it. Sophie smiled. She said it was the best part of her birthday. I believe her. What movie? Casablanca, which she has seen by her estimate 40 times and which she considers to still be worth watching at 41. Landon had a clear, sudden image of Sophie sitting on the edge of Helen's bed in the quiet of a care facility at the end of a long shift, holding a laptop so an 89-year-old woman could eat the cake she'd actually wanted and watch a movie she loved. He had the same feeling he'd had in the park, that particular interior settling, like something clicking into place. You're remarkable, he said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without preliminary. He realized, the second it was out, that it might land strangely. People were odd about being called remarkable. They either dismissed it or got uncomfortable. Sophie did neither. She looked at him steadily. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Make it into a story about my character. I just gave a woman a piece of cake. She picked up her fork. It's not complicated. It kind of is, Landon said. Most people are too tired to do the small things at the end of a long day. Most people haven't learned that the small things are the actual things, she said. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, Can I tell you something? Sure. I have a board meeting in 9 days that I'm dreading more than almost anything I've dealt with professionally. He said it more flatly than he'd intended, like a confession that came out sideways. There's a proposal to cut programs that serve elderly people in care facilities. My company runs them. They don't generate meaningful returns. The board wants them gone. Sophie set her fork down. Maplewood Gardens receives a subsidy from Hayes Medical Group, she said. He looked up. Something shifted in her expression. Not hostile, not yet, but recalibrating. He could see her doing the math. I know, he said. Is that why you... She stopped. Is that why you talked to me? In the parking lot? Because of the facility? No, he said it clearly. I didn't know where you worked when I walked over. I didn't know which facility. I barely knew anything about you. He met her eyes. I stopped because you were crying in a parking lot alone and your date had just left and it seemed like a bad thing to drive past. She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant was small enough that they could hear the woman in the kitchen giving instructions to someone in rapid Thai. Why are you telling me this? Sophie asked. About the programs. Because I sat across from you at Harlow's for 2 hours and I thought, you should know what the people on my side of the decision look like. He paused. And because you told me about Mr. Delgado and his stopwatch and Mrs. Okafor's pencil notes, and I've been unable to make them stop having faces since then. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Not warmly, exactly. More with the considered attention of someone who was deciding whether to believe something. What are you going to do? She said. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm working on it. You run the company, she said. You could just... It's more complicated than that. I have investors, fiduciary obligations, a board that has legal standing to challenge unilateral decisions. He said this without apology, but also without the particular arrogance of a man using complexity as a shield. I'm not helpless, but I can't just decide it differently and make it so. Sophie considered this. Then she picked up her fork again. Linda, our director, she's been fighting for that subsidy for 2 years. It funds 2.5 positions, which doesn't sound like much until you understand we're already operating with less than half the staff we should have. I know, he said. I read the impact assessment on Friday. She looked at him sharply. I requested a full one, he said, for all 3 programs. Something passed across her face. Something complicated. Not quite trust, and not quite gratitude, and not quite suspicion. Something between all 3 that didn't have a clean name. Okay, she said, and returned to her food. The conversation moved on. She didn't bring it up again, and neither did he. But something had changed in the air between them. A new awareness, the kind that comes when 2 people realize their separate lives have been touching at points neither of them fully knew about. After lunch, they walked back toward where Sophie had parked. The afternoon had turned clear and cool, the sky that particular October blue that Chicago did better than anywhere Landon could name. She had both bags of apples and the kale and the honey, and he'd offered to carry something, and she'd handed him the kale without ceremony, which was exactly the response he'd been hoping for because it meant she wasn't performing the whole thing. At her car, a 2016 Honda Civic with a small dent in the rear bumper that had clearly been there for a while, Sophie opened the trunk and loaded her bags with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had never had someone else to do this for her and didn't particularly need one. This was good, she said. Yeah, he said, it was. She closed the trunk, turned to him. I want to be straightforward about something, she said. Okay. I'm not in the market for anything complicated right now. My mom needs consistent attention. My schedule is a mess. I have approximately 3 evenings a month that don't belong to someone else. She said this evenly, without apology. I'm also aware that you're she gestured vaguely, a person with a complicated life, a daughter, a company. A pause. Whatever this is, I need it to be honest and low pressure, or it's not something I can do. Landon nodded. That's fair. You're not going to push back on that. Why would I? He said. You're telling me what's real. I'd rather know. She studied him. He stood on the sidewalk with her kale bag, which he was still holding because she hadn't taken it back, and he waited. Okay, she said again, in a different register this time. She took the kale. I'll see you. You'll see me, he said. She got in the car. He watched her pull out of the spot with the careful competence of someone who had parallel parked on Chicago streets for years and had made peace with the process. He stood on the sidewalk for a while after she turned the corner. The October wind came off the lake 6 blocks east and moved through the trees on the residential street. He was in a mood he didn't have precise language for, something between contentment and the awareness of wanting, which were close neighbors but not the same thing. He took out his phone and called Marcus for a pickup. While he waited, he thought about what she'd said. Low pressure and honest, or it's not something I can do. He understood this. He had a 6-year-old at home and a company in the middle of a decision that was going to cost him something, one way or another. He did not have a simple life. He had never been under the impression that his life was simple. But he was 32 years old, and he had spent 3 of those years understanding, slowly and imperfectly, how to live around an absence. And the past 2 Saturdays had been the first time in a long time that his life had felt less like something he was managing and more like something that was actually happening. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He was pretty sure doing nothing with it would be a mistake. He sent her one text before Marcus arrived. Same time next Saturday? Her response came back in 6 minutes. I'll check my mom's schedule, which was not a yes but was not a no, and contained within it the whole architecture of Sophie Bennett's life. The checking, the scheduling, the someone else who came first. He found to his own mild surprise that this did not frustrate him. It just was. Like her uniform, and the dented bumper, and the 4 minutes for the oatmeal. The particular texture of a life lived in relation to other people's needs. He thought, I want to know more of this. Then Marcus pulled up, and he got in the car, and he went home to his daughter, who was waiting for him with a printed diagram of the Hercules beetle that she had colored with approximately 17 different highlighters and wanted to discuss at length. He sat on the floor of her room with her diagram and her beetles for an hour, and for that hour he wasn't a CEO with a board vote approaching, and he wasn't a widower calculating something tender and uncertain. He was just a man on a carpet, and Mia was explaining with great solemnity that the rhinoceros beetle could carry 850 times its own weight. That's the strongest thing, pound for pound, she said. Mrs. Park says I need to be more diplomatic, but I'm not going to lie about the beetles. Nobody's asking you to lie about the beetles, Landon said. Good. She patted his hand. Want to see the dung beetle page? I cannot wait, he said, and meant it. The week that followed was dense and difficult in the way of weeks when a decision is incoming, and everyone around you is positioning for something. Gerald Whitmore sent 2 memos about the restructuring timeline. The lead investor on the CARE programs, a man named Richard Ashworth, who had the energy of someone who had made more money than he could reasonably spend, and was now deeply invested in the principle of making more, requested a call to discuss his concerns about the board's direction. Landon took the call. 38 minutes of careful professional disagreement. Ashworth was not an unreasonable man. That was the frustrating thing. He was the kind of unreasonable that wore the clothes of reason, that spoke in terms of fiduciary obligation and shareholder value and long-term sustainability. He wasn't wrong about the numbers. He was working from a framework that simply didn't have space for the things the numbers didn't capture. I hear your concerns about the community impact, Ashworth said, and I respect them, but we're running a company, Landon, not a foundation. I understand, Landon said. If you want to run a foundation, we can talk about setting one up separately, but you can't run the publicly traded entity as one. Landon said evenly, I'm going to present a full impact analysis at the board meeting. I'd like the decision to be made with complete information. A pause. Of course, Ashworth said, in a tone that meant he'd already counted votes. Landon hung up and sat for a while in the quiet of his office. From his window on the 22nd floor, Chicago spread in every direction, a city of 3 million people doing the same things people did everywhere. working and worrying and checking on their mothers and timing their oatmeal. He thought about what Sophie had said that first evening. They're people with entire histories. He picked up his phone. Not to call her, so it was a Tuesday. She was probably finishing her shift. He pulled up the impact assessment PDF instead, the full 112 pages that his research director had delivered on Friday, and he started reading from the beginning, every footnote, every case study, every number with the name attached. Page 47 had a section on Maplewood Gardens. 6 paragraphs. The subsidy funded 2.4 staff positions. The facility served 63 residents. The staff-to-resident ratio was already below the state minimum. The subsidy was keeping it from getting worse. He thought about Sophie staying late with an 89-year-old and a piece of chocolate cake. He highlighted the paragraph and wrote a note in the margin. What does this actually cost per resident per year? He worked until 9 o'clock. His housekeeper, Rosa, had left dinner in the fridge and a note that Mia had gone to bed at 8:30 after announcing she didn't like Tuesdays. He heated the food and ate it at the kitchen counter, looking at the city lights on the lake. He and Sophie had spoken on the phone once that week, briefly, on Thursday. She'd called to check something she'd heard from Linda, that Hayes Medical was renegotiating contracts with several facilities. He told her, honestly, that a proposal was being considered, but no decisions had been made. She asked if he could tell her more. He said he couldn't yet, which was also honest. She said okay, and then, after a brief pause, told him that Mr. Delgado had timed her that morning, and she'd been exactly right, and he'd given her a nod she could only describe as regal. He said, and I'm quoting, "You're becoming reliable," Sophie said, which from him is basically a standing ovation. Landon had laughed at that, genuinely, and the phone call had ended shortly after, and he'd been in a better mood for the rest of the afternoon in a way that was difficult to attribute to anything specific. Saturday came. Sophie texted Friday night. Mom's neighbor can come at noon. We good? He wrote back, we're good. They went to a museum. It had been Landon's suggestion, the Chicago History Museum, which he'd walked past 100 times without going in. Sophie was not the kind of woman who required an elaborate outing, which he'd understood by now, but she was the kind of woman who liked something to actually do rather than perform the activity of being somewhere together. The museum had an exhibition on the history of Chicago's labor movements, and she moved through it slowly, reading the placards, with the focused attention of someone for whom history was not decoration. He watched her stop at a photograph of nurses on a picket line in 1972. My grandmother was a home health aide, she said, without turning from the photo. She worked for 31 years for a family in Oak Park, raised their kids and helped raise me on weekends. Never had a pension, never had health insurance through the job. She paused. She's the reason I got into caregiving, not in a linear, intentional way, just, I think she made it feel like real work, important work. She glanced at him. A lot of people don't think of it that way. A lot of people are wrong, he said. Yeah, but a lot of people are also the ones setting the budgets. She said it without bitterness. As a plain fact, they ate lunch in the museum cafe, which was mediocre, and Sophie was cheerfully blunt about it, and they ended up talking about bad food they'd eaten in places that should have known better. And this somehow became a conversation about the first jobs they'd each had. And Landon told her about working summers at his uncle's plumbing supply company at 16, before the money, before the trajectory that had taken him to business school and then to the particular stratosphere of a healthcare empire. You know how to replace a P-trap, Sophie said. I do. I have one that's been draining slow for 3 weeks. I could fix that, he said. She gave him a sideways look. Sure you could. I'm serious. I believe that you believe that. Sophie, you're a billionaire, Landon. I was also a 16-year-old who spent 3 months in a warehouse counting fittings. He said it without defensiveness. I'm not incapable of practical things. She considered him. Then she said, if you can fix a P-trap, I will personally apologize to you. I'll hold you to that. The afternoon stretched in that easy, unforced way that good company could make time behave. They left the museum and walked for a while because the October weather was cooperating for once, and Sophie had an hour before she needed to get back to her mother. She walked with her hands in her jacket pockets and talked about a documentary she'd watched that week, and the upcoming mayoral election, and a book Mrs. Okafor had just lent her with the direction that she should read it slowly and not skim, which Sophie had taken as the challenge it was intended to be. "She's testing you," Landon said. "Of course she is." Sophie sounded fond about it. "She does it with everyone she likes. If she didn't think you were worth the trouble, she'd just be polite." "What does she do when she's just being polite?" "Ask about the weather." He laughed. They walked through a neighborhood that was half boutiques and half things that had been there 30 years ago and would probably be there 30 years from now. A dry cleaner, a corner store, a barber shop with a handwritten sign in the window. Sophie stopped at the corner. "I've got to head back," she said. "I know." She looked at him. The October light was low and direct and made everything sharper than it needed to be. "This is—" she started, stopped, tried again. "I'm having a good time." "That sounds simple, but it's not actually simple for me." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not ready for— I don't know what I'm ready for." She looked slightly frustrated with herself for the imprecision. "I just need you to know that I'm not— Sophie." He waited until she looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere. There's no timeline. We're just—" He gestured at the block around them. "Two people having a good Tuesday, or Saturday, whatever day it happens to be." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She turned to walk to her car, then stopped and half-turned back. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you should fight for those programs." He was quiet. "I know it's not my business," she said, "but you asked a room full of number crunchers to tell you what those programs are worth, and I'm telling you from the inside. They matter in ways that don't appear in an impact assessment." She paused. "That's all." She walked away. He stood on the corner for a moment in the clear afternoon light. He pulled out his phone, opened the email chain with his attorney. He typed, "I want to look at restructuring options that protect all three programs, not scaling back, protecting. Let's talk Monday." He put the phone in his pocket and walked to find Marcus. The board meeting was in 6 days. He still didn't know exactly what he was going to do. He knew what it would cost, not abstractly, but in real numbers, in his own money, in the kind of gamble that people in his position were not supposed to make on principle. He thought about Sophie's voice. Steady, plain. They matter in ways that don't appear in an impact assessment. He thought about 4,100 people. He thought about a stopwatch, a pencil and a margin. An 89-year-old woman eating chocolate cake at 9 o'clock at night, watching a movie she'd already seen 40 times. He thought about Margaret Bennett sitting on a park bench in the rain, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back, and her daughter staying with her in the wet dark and making sure she wasn't afraid. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about it all the way home. The board meeting was on a Wednesday. Landon had spent the 6 days before it doing something he rarely did. He'd been uncertain, not about the decision itself. The decision had clarified somewhere between the museum and Sophie's corner, somewhere in the space of her saying they matter in ways that don't appear in an impact assessment with the same plainness she used to say everything. The uncertainty was about execution, about which levers to pull and in what order, and how much of his own position he was willing to put on the table, and whether there was a version of this where he won cleanly or whether winning was going to require accepting some damage. He'd met with his attorney, Claire Nguyen, on Monday. Claire was 44, precise, and had the useful quality of telling him things he didn't want to hear without softening them for his comfort. She'd worked with him since the early days of Hayes Medical, which meant she'd been present for the decisions that had built the company and was not impressed by the ones that had simply grown it. "You're talking about putting your own capital into a restructuring proposal," she said, sitting across from him with a yellow legal pad and a pen she kept clicking. "Sacrificing your own executive bonuses for the next 3 years, using them as collateral to fund the continuation of these programs without drawing on investor returns." "That's what I'm talking about," Landon said. "And you're also proposing a tiered revenue model for the programs themselves, making them partially self-sustaining through a reformed billing structure." "Yes," Claire clicked her pen. "It's not an insane idea," she said, which from Claire was close to enthusiasm. The self-sustainability angle gives the board something to hold on to other than pure charity. If you can demonstrate a pathway to partial return within 18 months, my projections show 22 months, he said. I'm not going to shorten them just to make the number look better. She looked at him over her legal pad. Some of those board members are going to see right through the financing structure and understand that you're essentially paying for these programs yourself for the next several years. I know. Ashworth will use that. He'll say you've lost your objectivity, that you're running the company based on personal convictions rather than fiduciary duty. I have personal convictions, Landon said. So does he. The difference is, his make him money. Claire did not smile, but she wrote something down. I'll have the formal proposal ready by Tuesday night, she said. You present it Wednesday. I'll be in the room. I know you will. He spent Monday evening at home with Mia, who had moved on from the Beetle campaign and was now absorbed in a school project about oceans, which was, in her estimation, much bigger than people think. He helped her draw a cross-section of the Mariana Trench on a piece of poster board while she narrated facts she'd collected from a library book and 2 YouTube videos she'd watched with Rosa. The pressure at the bottom is 8 tons per square inch, Mia said. That would crush you. That would absolutely crush me, Landon agreed, but the fish there are fine. She added a fish to the poster with red crayon. They evolved. She looked at him. That means they got used to it. I know what it means. I just wasn't sure. She went back to the poster. Are you worried about something? He looked at her. 6 years old. Elena's eyes. Dark brown. Direct. Seeing things. A little, he said. About work? About a decision at work, yeah. She considered this while she colored another fish. Is it the right thing to do? I think so. Then you should probably do it. She said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had not yet learned that this was easier to say than to execute. He said, Yeah, probably. Can I put a squid here? She asked, pointing to the deep section of the trench. Put a squid there, he said. He texted Sophie that night. He didn't tell her about the meeting. It didn't feel right to discuss it before it happened, like talking about a thing before you'd done it could somehow complicate it. He just asked how her week was going, and she told him that Mr. Delgado had accepted a new aide on the floor with what she called the energy of a man reviewing a junior employee's first assignment, and that Mrs. Okafor had declared the book she'd lent Sophie to be a test Sophie had passed adequately, which Sophie had decided to take as a compliment. How's your week? She asked. Complicated, he wrote. Better for talking to you. A pause. Then, that's a lot of pressure to put on a text conversation. You're right. The text conversation is blameless. The week is just complicated. She sent back a single-word response. Good luck. Which was exactly the right thing. Not tell me everything, and not, I'm sure it'll be fine. Just good luck. Like she understood there were things that had to be gotten through and didn't require her to carry them. He thought, she's going to be difficult to let go of. Then he thought, don't borrow problems. Wednesday arrived the way difficult days arrived, just like any other, without warning music or atmospheric change. His alarm went off at 6. He ran 5 miles in the cold October morning, the kind of run where the air hurt going in and the rhythm took 20 minutes to find, but once he had it, he could go indefinitely. He came home, showered, stood in his closet for 90 seconds, deciding on a suit the way he decided on most things, by eliminating options until one remained. He got to the office at 8:15. His assistant, Jordan, who was 28 and ran the logistics of his life with a competence that still occasionally startled him, had his coffee ready and a printed copy of the proposal and a look on her face that told him she'd read it. It's bold, she said. Is that good or bad? Depends on the room, Jordan said. I've arranged for the full impact assessment to be distributed to all board members by 9. Hard copies and digital. Good. Gerald's already here, she said. He got here at 7:30. I know, Landon said. He always gets here early when he thinks he's already won. He spent the next hour in his office reviewing the proposal once more, not because he didn't know it, but because he needed the material in his hands, in his body, not in his head where arguments lived, but in the particular calm that came from being entirely prepared. He'd built this company from a regional chain of clinics into a national healthcare organization over 8 years. He'd done it with a series of decisions, some brilliant and some costly, and some both simultaneously. He'd never once made a decision that he wasn't willing to defend in the room. He thought about Sophie's grandmother, 31 years, no pension. He thought about 4,100 people who would each receive a form letter about service transitions. He thought about Gerald Whitmore saying they've served their purpose optics-wise, and the 12 people around the table who'd moved on to the next agenda item. At 9:55, he walked into the boardroom. There were 14 people in the room, 12 board members, Claire at the far end, and Gerald, who had taken the seat to Landon's right, with the pointed calm of a man who had prepared for a different kind of meeting and was now recalibrating. Richard Ashworth, participating remotely, occupied the large screen at the end of the table in high definition, wearing a jacket that suggested he was in a different time zone and had gotten up specifically for this. Landon didn't do preamble. He set the proposal on the table, squared it, and looked at the room. I want to start by acknowledging the financial analysis that was presented 2 weeks ago, he said. It's accurate. The 3 programs under discussion do not generate positive returns by the metrics we applied. I'm not going to argue the numbers. Gerald made a small, satisfied movement. What I'm going to argue, Landon continued, is the framework we use to evaluate them. And then I'm going to make a specific financially structured proposal that I'm asking this board to consider before any vote. He walked them through it. All of it. The full impact assessment, the case studies, the per-resident cost analysis that his research team had broken down into figures that were, when you actually looked at them, startlingly modest. He talked about the 14-month county waiting list. He talked about what happened to care facilities when subsidy programs disappeared. Not in abstract terms, but in the specific documented cases from 3 other states where similar programs had been cut and facilities had closed within 18 months, and the populations they served had been redistributed into emergency systems that cost 4 times as much. The argument that these programs are philanthropic liabilities assumes that the alternative is neutral, Landon said. It isn't. The alternative is a more expensive systemic failure that arrives on a different budget line. He watched the room. Some faces were with him. Some were not. Gerald's face was the careful blank of a man who was waiting for the moment to push back. Then Landon put the financing proposal on the table. He explained it clearly without editorializing. His own executive bonuses, 3 years of them, directed into a restructuring fund that would sustain the programs while the reformed billing model developed revenue. No investor capital, no shareholder impact. His money. The room went quiet in a specific way, the quiet of people recalculating. You're proposing to personally fund these programs, Ashworth said from the screen. His voice was measured, but there was an edge in it that Landon recognized, the edge of a man whose counterargument had just become more complicated. I'm proposing a financing structure in which I absorb the transition cost, Landon said. Yes. That's not how a CEO manages a company, Gerald said. You're conflating personal conviction with fiduciary responsibility. I'm using my own money, Landon said, which by definition is outside fiduciary scope. It creates a conflict of interest. Claire, Landon said. Claire looked up from her legal pad. The financing structure has been reviewed, she said. There is no legal conflict. Mr. Hayes' compensation is his to direct as he sees fit. The company's obligation to shareholders is met entirely through the reformed billing model, which is projected to reach partial self-sustainability within 22 months. The restructuring fund is a bridge. A 22-month bridge is shorter than the average runway we gave the Midwest Clinic expansion in 2019, Landon said, which took 31 months and is now one of our top 3 revenue generators. Silence. Gerald leaned forward. Landon, I have genuine respect for what you're trying to do here, but you are letting personal relationships cloud your business judgment. A pause. We've all seen the social media coverage. And there it was. Landon kept his face still. Say what you mean, Gerald. You've been seen publicly with a woman who works at one of the facilities we're discussing. That's relevant how exactly? It creates the appearance of what? Landon's voice was level, but there was something underneath it that silenced the room. Of understanding what we're actually talking about? Because I'll tell you what I understand. I understand that we have been discussing 4,100 human beings as a budget line item, and I brought that line item to life. And now you want to suggest that having context for a business decision is a liability. He looked at Gerald. Is that the argument? Gerald didn't answer. The vote was called at 11:47, 7 in favor, 5 against. The proposal passed. Landon sat in the quiet boardroom for several minutes after people filed out. Claire stayed. She sat at the end of the table with her legal pad and didn't say anything while he sat with the outcome. You know this isn't over, she said finally. Ashworth will look for leverage points in the restructuring. Gerald's going to be difficult for a while. I know, Landon said. You also just committed a significant portion of your personal compensation for the next 3 years. I know that too. She nodded once. Good meeting, she said, and left. He sat alone in the boardroom for another few minutes. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was doing what it always did, going, moving, existing in the particular indifferent abundance of a major city. He could see from 22 floors up a slice of Lake Michigan between buildings. Gray-blue today, the October color. He picked up his phone. He didn't call Sophie. He wanted to, and that wanting was exactly why he didn't. Because the decision hadn't been made for her, and calling her right after felt like collapsing those two things together in a way that wasn't clean. He sent one text to Jordan. It passed. Jordan responded in 30 seconds. I'll have the implementation timeline ready by end of day. He put the phone away and went back to work. He found out about the photograph 3 days later. He hadn't known anyone was watching at the farmer's market, which, in retrospect, was naive. He was a recognizable person in a city where being recognizable had consequences. And he'd spent 2 Saturdays in public with a woman who was not a public figure, and someone had apparently been paying attention. The photograph that appeared on a gossip blog called Chicago Circuit, a site Landon had been aware of in the same way you were aware of traffic noise, as a background condition of urban existence, showed him and Sophie at the farmer's market, walking with her canvas bags, mid-conversation. It was not an unflattering photo. It was simply a photo. The caption, however, was doing considerable work. Hayes Medical CEO. Landon. Hayes seen cozying up to mystery woman. Sources say she's a caregiver at one of the company's subsidy facilities. Conflict of interest or just a billionaire's new charity case? Jordan showed it to him on a Friday morning with the expression of someone delivering bad news they've pre-organized. It's getting traction, she said. A couple of the larger Chicago social accounts picked it up last night. It's, she chose the word carefully, multiplying. Landon read the caption twice. Something went cold and tight in his chest. Not for himself. He'd had worse said about him in rooms with lawyers present. For Sophie, who had been standing in a parking lot 3 weeks ago, crying quietly so no one would notice, because a man had looked at her uniform and decided she wasn't worth his time. He put the phone down carefully. Don't respond to any press inquiries, he said. I wasn't planning to, Jordan said. He called Sophie from his office at noon. She picked up on the third ring. She was between shifts, she said, her voice carrying the slightly compressed quality of someone in a hallway or a break room. I saw it, she said, before he could get there. Linda forwarded it to me this morning. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't. You didn't do anything, Sophie said. Someone took a photo of 2 people walking. That's a brief silence. I'm okay. Are you? Another silence. Longer. I'm at work, she said. I don't have time to not be okay right now. He understood that. He also understood that this was Sophie's default. Convert the thing into something manageable. Deal with it at a time when dealing was possible. He'd been watching her do this for 3 weeks. Can I call you tonight? He said. Yeah, she said. After 8. He called at 8:15. She answered from home, which he could tell because the ambient sound was different, quieter, with the small domestic noises of an apartment in the evening. Her mother was asleep. She told him she'd spent the afternoon reading the comments. He told her that was a mistake, and she said she knew, and that she'd done it anyway because ignoring things didn't make them not exist, which was such a Sophie answer that it landed somewhere between admiration and helplessness. What were they saying? He asked. The usual. Her voice was flat and careful. That I'm after your money. That I'm a... There was one particularly creative one about me being a poverty tourist attraction. She paused. A lot of people are very certain about who I am and what I want without knowing a single thing about me. I'm sorry, he said again. Stop apologizing, she said. You didn't write the caption. No, but I knew what my life looked like from the outside when I asked you to lunch, and I should have... What? She said. What should you have done? Not talk to me? Kept me secret? Her voice had an edge to it he hadn't heard before. Not anger at him, but something harder than that. Exhaustion, maybe. The particular exhaustion of someone who had expected this and was still not enjoying being right. I'm not embarrassed to be seen with you. I just prefer not to be discussed. I know. The thing that's... She stopped, started again. The thing that bothers me most is the charity case line. Like the only way to explain why a man with money would talk to me is that he's performing generosity. Like it couldn't just be... She didn't finish the sentence. Like what? Landon said. A pause. Nothing. Sophie. I don't know what this is, she said, and I was okay with not knowing. And now there's a photograph and a caption and an entire comment section that thinks they know exactly what it is, and She exhaled. I'm used to people underestimating me. I'm not used to it happening this loudly. He sat with that for a moment. He was in his home office in the blue dark of the evening, and he thought about the best thing to say and rejected 3 of them before arriving at the truth. I think you're the most competent, clear-eyed person I've met in a long time, he said, and I'm aware that's a thing people say. I mean it specifically. I mean the way you handled finding your mother in the park. I mean the 4-minute oatmeal. I mean the way you talk about your residents like they're... He paused. Like they're worth talking about. I mean that you told me what you needed in this situation on the second date, which was parking lot to farmer's market in 2 weeks, and I'd like to challenge anyone who wrote that caption to tell me what your actual net worth is. Sophie was quiet for a long time. That was either the most unnecessarily nice thing anyone said to me, she said, or the most effective lobbying I've encountered. Can it be both? She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. I need to think, she said, about this. About... She gestured vaguely at the situation with whatever word that gesture was. About what it means to be in someone's life when their life comes with all of this attached. That's fair, he said. It's not about you, she said. Or, it's not only about you. It's about what I can handle right now. My mom is having a harder week. I've got 2 staff out sick at Maplewood, and we're scrambling to cover shifts. And now I'm apparently a news story. She paused. I have a very limited supply of energy, and I need to be strategic about where it goes. I understand. Do you? Not challenging, genuinely asking. More than you might think, he said. I have a 6-year-old who needs me fully present. I have a company in the middle of a transition. There are exactly 17 people in my life who I trust to tell me the truth about things, and 3 of them are on my payroll. He paused. I'm not looking for someone to complete my life, Sophie. I'm looking for... He stopped, found the honest word. For somewhere I don't have to perform. The line was quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The kind where something is being absorbed. Okay, she said, finally, quietly. I hear that. Good. I'm still going to need a few days, she said. Take them. You're being very understanding about this. You told me low pressure, he said. I meant it. She said goodnight. He sat in the blue dark after she hung up and didn't move for a while. The press attention got worse before it got better. By Monday, 2 larger outlets had picked up the Chicago circuit piece, and someone, Landon's communications director, Martin, had his suspicions and was quietly investigating, had leaked the detail that Hayes Medical was in the middle of a major restructuring decision involving elder care facilities. The leak combined with the photograph produced a narrative that was reductive and convenient and exactly the kind of story that spread quickly because it didn't require nuance. Billionaire CEO suspends major care facility cuts after romantic involvement with facility employee. That was the headline on a business news site that Landon read over coffee on Monday morning and then put face down on the kitchen counter because Mia was eating breakfast, and he didn't want her to see his expression. "You look like your coffee's wrong," Mia observed. "My coffee's fine," he said. "Then your face is wrong," she said. He looked at his daughter. "Something at work," he said. "The same something." "Related," he said. Mia ate a spoonful of cereal. "Did you do the right thing?" "Yeah," he said. "I did." "Then," she said, with the certainty of someone who did not yet understand how frequently right things created problems, "it'll be okay." He did not have her confidence, but he kissed the top of her head and started getting her backpack together because it was 7:45 and the bus came at 8:03, and Mia had a thing about being on time that she had gotten entirely from him. At the office, Martin was already in damage control mode. He wanted a statement, carefully worded, acknowledging the timeline in a way that decoupled the personal situation from the board decision. "We can demonstrate that the proposal predated any public association," Martin said. "Claire can provide documentation of the Monday meeting timeline. It will diffuse the conflict of interest story." "It will also invite more questions about Sophie," Landon said. Martin paused. "Yes," he said. "There's that." "Don't issue a statement," Landon said. "Not yet." Martin looked pained. "The longer we—" "I know." Landon rubbed the back of his neck. "Give me until Wednesday." He needed to talk to Sophie before anything public was said, and Sophie needed her few days, and Landon needed to respect that even when the external situation was pressing against it. He was aware that this was a situation where the people who counseled him professionally would tell him to prioritize the company's narrative, and where his own instinct was to prioritize the person he'd made a commitment to, and he was choosing his instinct, which was either integrity or sentimentality or both, and he could sort that out later. Sophie called him Tuesday morning. He was in his car between a meeting and a site visit, and her name appeared on the screen, and he answered with the particular quality of attention you gave calls you'd been waiting for. "I've been thinking," she said. "I figured." "The article," she started, "the conflict of interest story." "It's not accurate," he said. "The timeline." "I know," she said. "I looked up the board meeting dates. The proposal was filed before the farmers market. Before Harlow's, actually, by your own email timestamp." A pause. "I know how to read a public record, Landon." Something shifted in him, something warm and specific. "Yeah," he said, "I know you do." "But here's the thing," Sophie said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has thought about something from multiple angles and arrived somewhere difficult. "Even if the decision was entirely separate from me, and I believe that it was, the story is already written. And people in that story are going to look at me in a certain way. The residents' families, my colleagues, Linda." A pause. "Linda actually asked me if I knew about the subsidy situation when we met, which meant she was wondering if I—" "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That I knew you were in healthcare administration, that I didn't know about the programs until our second conversation, that I told you to fight for them because it was the right thing to do, not because I was negotiating." The word came out with a slight bitterness. She believed me. But the fact that the question came up at all. "I'm sorry," Landon said. "You've said that a lot." "I keep meaning it." Sophie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, more honest, maybe, in the way that quiet voices sometimes were. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it." "Okay." "I like you," she said. "Genuinely. Not because of your money or your position or any of the things that article implies. I like the way you listened when I talked about my residence. I like that you sent flowers with a note that just said, 'Parking lot stranger,' because you knew your name wasn't the point yet. I like that you showed up with no umbrella and said you were aware of how it sounded and asked anyway." She paused. "I am not a woman who is easily impressed by money. My ex had money. It's a feature, not a quality." Landon didn't say anything. He was watching Chicago go past through the car window and listening with everything he had. "But I'm scared," she said, "of this, of what it does to my life if it becomes something. of what it already did to my reputation at work just by existing for 6 weeks, of, she stopped, of wanting something I don't know how to want safely. I'm scared too, he said. It came out before he'd thought about it, and it was true, and he let it be true without qualification. I have been since the night in the park. You asked me if I wanted to know the truth, and this is it. You scared me. In the best way. The kind of scared that means something matters. The line hummed quietly. I need more time, she said. Okay. That's not... She hesitated. That's not me walking away. I know, he said. Take the time. After the call, he sat in the car for an additional 2 minutes after Marcus had pulled up to the site visit location, not moving, just sitting with the weight of it. The particular weight of something that might be important and might also be on the edge of being lost. Gerald was waiting for him in the lobby. Whatever conversation was about to happen between them, it was going to require that Landon be entirely present and entirely himself, and he was going to have to set all of this down somewhere and come back to it later. He set it down. He got out of the car. He straightened his jacket. He walked inside. The afternoon went long and contentious, and Gerald made 3 separate references, each less subtle than the last, to the press coverage and its implications for the company's credibility in the restructuring period. Each time, Landon acknowledged the concern and redirected to the substance, and each time he could feel Gerald's frustration calcifying into something more deliberate. At 4:30, Gerald stopped him in the hall outside the conference room when everyone else had gone. You should know, Gerald said, that Ashworth is talking to 2 of the other board members about the restructuring timeline, about whether the terms of your proposal create a precedent that limits future decision-making. He paused. About whether this is the kind of leadership the company needs in this period. Landon looked at him. Is that a warning or a threat, Gerald? Gerald's face was unreadable. It's information. What you do with it is your business. He walked away. Landon stood in the corridor for a moment, alone. The building was emptying around him, the particular late afternoon quiet of a corporate space after hours, and he thought about what Gerald had just told him, which was that the vote that had passed last Wednesday was not the end of the fight, but possibly just the end of the opening round. He'd known that. Claire had told him. He'd built it into his understanding of how this was going to go. He just hadn't factored it in alongside everything else. He thought about Sophie saying, I'm scared of wanting something I don't know how to want safely. And he thought about Ashworth counting votes. And he thought about Mia's drawing of the Mariana Trench, the little fish she'd colored red surviving at the bottom because they'd evolved, because they'd gotten used to the pressure. He pulled out his phone. He almost texted Sophie. He stopped himself. She needed time. He'd said he'd give it. He meant what he said. He texted Mia's grandmother instead, confirmed pickup arrangements, then put his phone away and walked back toward his office to do the work that still needed doing, with the company that was still his to run, on the day that had gone the way days went. Not cleanly, not easily, but forward. Always forward. That was in the end the only direction any of it moved. The few days Sophie had asked for stretched into 2 weeks. Landon didn't push. He'd meant what he said about low pressure, and meaning it turned out to require more discipline than he'd anticipated. Not because he was impatient by nature, but because the external situation kept generating reasons why waiting felt increasingly costly. The press coverage had not quieted. It had done what press coverage did when no one fed it a counter-narrative. It got creative. A second article appeared in a business weekly, this one more measured in tone but more damaging in content, which outlined the timeline of the board vote and the public sightings with the careful implication of a connection without quite stating one. Martin forwarded it with a subject line that just said, "We need to talk." They talked. Landon authorized a limited statement, 1 paragraph, factual, confirming that the restructuring proposal had been filed before any personal association, providing Claire's documentation of the timeline. He refused to characterize his relationship with Sophie in any way, which Martin told him would be read as confirmation of something significant. Landon told him that was fine. Martin looked at the ceiling briefly before accepting this. What the statement did not stop was the social media commentary, which had moved past the question of conflict of interest into something more personal and more corrosive. Sophie's name was now attached to search results that described her variously as a gold digger, an opportunist, and, in the more charitable interpretations, a charity project. Someone had found her workplace and posted its address. Someone else had found an old Facebook photo of her and Margaret at a family event 3 years ago and was using it to speculate about her background. Landon found out about the Facebook photo from Jordan, who had been quietly monitoring the coverage with the thoroughness of someone who understood that information was better held than discovered. He sat with it for a full minute before asking Jordan to have their legal team review whether anything constituted actionable harassment. Jordan said she'd already started that process. He said thank you. She said of course, and left him alone with it. He wrote Sophie a text that he deleted 3 times before landing on, "I want you to know I'm having our legal team look at some of the targeted posts. Not because you asked, you didn't. Because it's the right thing to do and I should have done it sooner." She responded 4 hours later. "Thank you. I didn't know you were doing that." He wrote, "You shouldn't have had to ask." A pause. Then, "Can I call you tonight?" "Yes," he wrote. Immediately. She called at 9. Her mother had been unsettled all day, one of the harder days, the kind where Margaret's displacement was constant and close to the surface, where every room in the apartment seemed to remind her of something that wasn't there anymore. Sophie had spent the evening making dinner and watching her mother search through a box of old photographs with the focused intensity of someone looking for something they couldn't name. "She kept picking up a photo of my dad from their trip to Portugal," Sophie said. "He's in front of some fountain. She kept saying, 'He looks tired, he needs to rest,' and I just—" She stopped. "I just agreed. Every time. 'He looks tired, yeah, Mom. He'll rest soon.'" Her voice was doing the thing it did when she was holding something carefully, flat on the surface, careful with the syllables, the way you walked on ice. "How are you?" Landon asked. "I've been better," she said, which was significant because Sophie's benchmark for admitting she'd been better was set very high. "Do you want to talk about any of it? The press stuff?" "No." A pause. "Yes. I don't know." She exhaled. "Someone from Maplewood, a family member of one of the residents. She came in today to visit her father, and she looked at me differently, like she was deciding something about me." Sophie's voice was still careful. "I don't know what she'd read or who she'd talk to, but I felt it, the recalibration. I'm sorry. I know you are." She didn't say it coldly, more like she was acknowledging a fact of the situation rather than accepting an apology. "The thing is, I've worked at that facility for 4 years. I know those residents. I know their schedules and their preferences, and which ones need the lights adjusted at night, and which ones want the window cracked in the morning regardless of temperature. And one photograph and a caption has people looking at me like I might be, I don't know, like I might want something from them." "You don't," he said. "I know I don't." And there it was, the particular exhaustion of a person who has to defend their own character to people who had never questioned it before. "My reputation at that place is the thing I've built over 4 years. It's mine. And now it's complicated by association." Landon sat with this, not trying to fix it, just sitting with it. There was a version of himself that would have moved to reassurance. It'll pass. People will see. The truth will be clear. He didn't trust that version. The truth was that some people would see it and some wouldn't, and the ones who didn't would hold their revised opinion of Sophie Bennett past the point where the news cycle had moved on, and she would carry that in a workplace she needed. "I'm sorry I came over to you in that parking lot," he said. The line went quiet. "I don't mean that," he said. "I'm not sorry, but I understand if you—" "I'm not sorry either," Sophie said. Her voice had changed. Something had gone out of the careful flatness. "That's the thing that's making this hard. If I were sorry, it would be easier. I could just walk back from it. Say it was a mistake, but I don't think it was a mistake. I think you're—" She stopped. "What?" he said. "I think you're one of the better people I've met," she said. Not romantic, not performance, just a fact, stated with the directness of someone who didn't compliment lightly. "And I think that makes this harder, not easier." "Why harder?" "Because if you were what they're saying you are, if any of this was what they're implying it is, I could be angry. I could use the anger to make it simple. A long pause. But you sent flowers addressed to the parking lot stranger. You drove me around a city at midnight to find my mother. You built a financial proposal that bet 3 years of your own money on the idea that 4,100 people were worth the bet. She breathed. So I can't be angry. I'm just scared, he said. Yeah. He understood this. He understood it in the specific, non-abstract way of a person who had sat in this same room 3 years ago and decided, after Elena, that whatever came next was going to be earned differently, more honestly, with less performance and more actual showing up. Can I tell you something? He said. Sure. Mia asked me last week if I'd made a new friend, he said. I said yes. She asked what your name was, and I told her. And she said that was a good name for a friend. He paused. She has strong opinions about names. She told me last year that her stuffed elephant was named incorrectly, and she was right. Sophie made a sound. A real one this time. A laugh that came out small and surprised and relieved. What was it named? Gerald? That's a bad name for an elephant. Agreed. She renamed it Percy. He waited a beat. She doesn't ask me about people often. She's careful about who she asks about. Silence. Then, what did you tell her about me? That you work hard and you're funny and you look after people who need looking after, he said. She said that sounded like a good job. I told her it was. Sophie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different again, softer, but not in the careful way, in the way of something letting go. I want to meet her someday, she said. Not now, that's not what I mean. I know what you mean, he said. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They talked for another 30 minutes about smaller things. Her mother's good moments from the week, a documentary Landon had half-watched while reviewing contracts. The fact that Mia's ocean project had received what Ms. Park described as enthusiastic engagement from the class, which Mia had taken as her due and moved past. By the time they hung up, something had shifted, not resolved, not arrived at any conclusion, but different from the week before. Less like two people on the edge of something, and more like two people who had decided to stay in the same place for a while and see what it looked like from there. It was the second week of November when everything came back to the board. Landon had known it was coming. Claire had told him. Gerald had told him, in the corridor outside the conference room, with the careful wording of a man who was conveying information without technically threatening anything. What he hadn't anticipated was the specific form it took. A formal motion, filed by Ashworth through the board's governance committee, requesting a review of the restructuring proposal's implementation timeline on grounds that the financial projections had been insufficiently validated. He's not wrong that the projections are aggressive, Claire said. She was in his office on a Monday morning with her legal pad and her clicking pen and the particular expression she wore when delivering news she respected the difficulty of. The 22-month runway assumes an optimistic uptake rate on the reform billing model. I know, Landon said. I built the model. He's going to use the press coverage as context, not as formal grounds. He can't, legally, but as context, to argue that your judgment in this area has been compromised. My judgment has not been compromised. I know that, Claire said. The governance committee will decide what they know. The review was scheduled for a Thursday in November, 3 weeks out. Landon spent those 3 weeks doing 3 things: working on a supplemental financial analysis that shored up the projection methodology, managing a company that was still running 17 other programs and serving 1,200 employees who had their own needs and schedules and crises, and spending whatever time remained being a father to a 7-year-old. Mia's birthday had been on the 8th, celebrated with a Beatle-themed cake that Rosa had ordered from a bakery that had clearly not received many Beatle-themed requests but had executed admirably, and a man in something with Sophie that didn't have a clean name yet but was becoming clearer. He saw Sophie twice in those 3 weeks. Once for coffee, brief, on a Wednesday afternoon when she had a window between a morning shift and an evening medication round. The coffee place was close to Maplewood, her choice, a narrow space with 4 tables and a pressed tin ceiling and coffee that was better than it had any right to be given how little space there was for equipment. She came in with her jacket still on and her lanyard tucked under her collar and the slightly compressed energy of someone between things. She sat down across from him, wrapped both hands around the cup the way she always did, and said, without preamble, "Linda told me this morning that the first installment of the restructuring fund transferred to Maplewood's account." "End of month," Landon said. "That was the timeline." "She cried," Sophie said. "Linda, in her office. She doesn't cry in front of staff, but I walked by and the door was open and—" She stopped. Something crossed her face that was too many things to name. "She's been fighting for that funding for 2 years. She does the schedule herself because she can't afford a full administrator. She works 55 hours a week, and she drives a 2012 Civic that she's been talking about replacing since I started." "I know," he said. "I met with her as part of the impact assessment process." Sophie looked up. "When?" "Early November, before the board review." He paused. "I met with directors at 6 of the facilities. I wanted the committee to see faces and names, not just metrics." She held his gaze. The narrow coffee place was quiet around them. "You didn't tell me that," she said. "You needed space," he said. "I wasn't going to fill it with things I was doing." She looked at him for a long moment. "Landon," she said. "Yeah." "I need you to understand something." She set down her coffee cup. "I have spent the last 4 years being extremely self-sufficient, deliberately, because the alternative was needing people who weren't reliable, and I decided reliable was more important than close." She said this without self-pity, as a statement of her own history. "My ex left, my dad died, my mom is—" She paused. "Is becoming someone who needs me in a way that goes in one direction." She looked at the table. "I'm very good at functioning without support. I'm much less good at knowing what to do with it when it shows up." "I know," he said. "You're very consistent," she said. "That's—" She searched for the word. "That's unusual for me, in my experience. I'm aware that's a low bar." "It's not nothing," she said. "Actually," he said, "no, it's not nothing." She picked up her coffee again. The tin ceiling reflected the light in a warm, irregular way. Outside, the November street did what Chicago did in November. The wind moved through it with serious intentions. "I'm still figuring out how to do this," she said. Whatever this is, I'm still figuring it out." "Me too," he said. "You don't seem like you are." "I'm better at not seeming it," he said. "I have a lot of practice managing the appearance of having things sorted." He looked at her honestly. "Inside, I'm fairly uncertain about most of this. I just know that I'm more certain about you than I've been about anything in a long time that doesn't involve my daughter or my company." Sophie looked at him. The looking she did, direct, assessing the absence of performance, was something he'd been on the receiving end of for 2 months now and still hadn't fully gotten used to, which he thought was probably a good sign. "Okay," she said. The same okay she'd been saying since the farmer's market, each time in a slightly different register, each one meaning something slightly different. This one meant, "I believe you." The second time he saw her in November was at Maplewood. This had not been planned. He had a site visit scheduled with Linda, a formal one, part of the implementation process, and Sophie was working. He hadn't told her he was coming because the visit was professional, and he'd genuinely not thought to mention it, which turned out to be the right call, because when she walked around a corner in the hallway with a medication cart and found him standing there in conversation with Linda, her expression did something that was involuntary and therefore telling. She recovered fast, but he'd seen it. "Sophie," Linda said, "Mr. Hayes was asking about the staffing transition. I thought maybe you could speak to how the additional coverage has affected the morning rounds." Sophie looked at him once, quickly, the look of someone recalibrating in real time. Then she looked at Linda. "It's been significant," she said. "We've been able to move the medication rounds earlier, which means the residents who have trouble sleeping aren't being woken up on a crisis schedule. Mr. Delgado's morning routine has normalized by about 20 minutes. "Is that good?" Landon asked. "He times me," Sophie said. "When he has time to time me properly, he's at his best." She said this entirely professionally, and he maintained an entirely professional expression, and Linda, who was not an unobservant woman, looked between the two of them once and then directed her attention to her clipboard. After the formal portion of the visit, Linda took a phone call in her office, and Landon found himself in the hallway alone for a moment. Sophie came back around the corner from the medication round, cart ahead of her, and stopped. "You could have told me you were coming," she said, quietly. "It was a professional visit," he said. "I didn't want to make it feel like more than it was." She considered this. Was that the right call or the convenient one? He thought about it honestly. Possibly both. She nodded slowly. "Mr. Delgado is in room 14, she said. "If you want to understand what this looks like from the inside." She paused. "Totally up to you." He went to room 14. Mr. Delgado was 86, small, sharp-eyed, and was watching a news program at a volume that suggested he had very little patience for anything that wasn't clear. He looked at Landon with the frank assessment of a man who had outlived most of his contemporaries and had therefore stopped allocating patience to people who hadn't earned it. "You're the administrator?" he said. "In a sense," Landon said. "You don't look like an administrator." "What do administrators look like?" Mr. Delgado considered. "Tired and apologetic," he said. "You look like something else." He muted the news. "Sit down. You're blocking the screen." Landon sat. They talked for 22 minutes. Mr. Delgado asked him directly about the restructuring. He'd heard things, he said, the way people in care facilities heard things, through the particular information network of people who had a lot of time to pay attention to what staff discussed in hallways. He wanted to know if the funding was secure. "For now," Landon said honestly. "I'm working to make it more than for now." "That's a politician's answer," Mr. Delgado said. "I know. The honest version is, I can commit to the next 3 years with certainty. Beyond that depends on decisions that aren't mine alone." Mr. Delgado looked at him for a moment. "Sophie said you were in healthcare," he said. "I am." "She didn't say you were in charge of it." Landon paused. "No, she didn't." "Why not?" "I think she was deciding what was relevant," Landon said. Mr. Delgado made a sound that might have been approval. "She's careful," he said, "about what's relevant." He looked at the muted news program. "She's also the only person in this building who gets the oatmeal right. I've told her this. She should know her value." "I think she does," Landon said. "People who know their value don't usually need it confirmed," Mr. Delgado said. "People who've had it questioned do." Landon sat with that for a moment. "You're not just here for the site visit," Mr. Delgado said. "Not a question." "No," Landon said. Mr. Delgado nodded once. Then he unmuted the news, which was dismissal. Landon thanked him. As he reached the door, Mr. Delgado said, without looking away from the screen, "If she trusts you enough to let you meet us, don't be someone she has to untrust. That's work I shouldn't have to watch her do." Landon stopped in the doorway. "No," he said, "it's not." He found Sophie in the hallway, wrapping up the last of the medication round. She saw his face and waited. "He told me about the oatmeal," Landon said. "He tells everyone about the oatmeal. He also said other things." Landon paused. "He's remarkable." Sophie looked at the closed door of room 14 with an expression he recognized by now. The particular complicated affection of someone who had been responsible for a difficult person for long enough that the difficulty had become a feature. "He doesn't let just anyone sit in his room," she said. "He usually tells people he's busy. He told me I was blocking the screen. That's basically a welcome," she said. Linda reappeared at the end of the hall, phone back in her pocket, and the professional geometry of the afternoon reasserted itself. Landon wrapped up with Linda, reviewed the staffing documents she'd prepared, answered 2 questions about the billing model timeline. Sophie moved back into the rhythm of her shift. He did not stop her as she passed, though she glanced at him once, a quick, private look, the kind that existed in a completely separate register from everything around it. He drove back to the office with Marcus and spent the afternoon on the supplemental financial analysis for the governance review. The Thursday of the review arrived cold and overcast in the way of late November days that hadn't decided whether to snow. Landon wore a dark suit and drank his coffee standing at the window of his office, looking at the lake, which was the color of iron today. He had prepared. He had done everything that preparation could do. The supplemental analysis addressed every methodological concern that could be raised about the projection model. Claire had reviewed it 4 times. Jordan had formatted it with the precision of someone who understood that presentation was not separate from substance. What Landon could not prepare for was the room, and rooms were always the variable. There were 11 people in the governance committee meeting. Ashworth was on screen again, jacket different, same time zone. Gerald was present in a way that was difficult to describe. He was sitting, he was quiet, but the quality of his attention had the focused stillness of someone who was waiting to see how something played out before deciding where they stood. The formal review took 40 minutes. Landon presented. The committee asked questions, some technical, some that were technical in form, but pointed in intent. Ashworth asked 3 questions, each one precisely calibrated to create doubt without being dismissible, and Landon answered each one with the supplemental data and the directness of someone who was not interested in performing certainty, but also would not be backed into false uncertainty. The projection methodology accounts for a conservative uptake rate, Landon said. I built the model to survive an underperformance scenario. If the billing reform hits 60% of projected uptake, which would require significant market headwinds, the fund still bridges the gap. I've run it both ways. And if the program underperforms at 40%, Ashworth asked, then I absorb additional personal cost. He said it flat, without drama, which I've documented in the supplemental as a contingency commitment. The room was quiet. You're willing to put more of your own money on this, said a board member named Patricia Osei, who ran her own healthcare nonprofit and had voted yes in the original meeting and whose expression now was unreadable. If that's what it requires, Landon said. Yes. Ashworth looked at him from the screen. Why? The room went still in a different way, not the stillness of professional calculation. Something else. Landon took a breath. He set down the pen he'd been holding and looked at the screen. Because I spent 2 hours in a restaurant with a woman who told me about an 86-year-old man who times his oatmeal, he said. And 3 hours in a city at midnight helping find her mother, who has dementia and was sitting on a park bench waiting for her dead husband to come back from the grocery store. He paused. And I spent one afternoon in a care facility room with that same 86-year-old man who told me the only person in the building who gets the oatmeal right is his caregiver. And I thought about 4,100 people who have caregivers like that. And I thought about what it means when the systems that support those caregivers are called liabilities. He looked at the room. That's why. Silence. Gerald was looking at the table. Patricia Osei uncapped her pen and wrote something on her notepad. She didn't show it to anyone. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. Then, this is going to follow you, Landon. The personal association. The press. I know, Landon said. It will color board confidence in your objectivity going forward. Then the board will have to decide whether they'd rather have a CEO with no convictions or one who's transparent about them, Landon said. I'd argue the latter is more valuable and more rare. Another silence. The vote on the review was called at 11:12. 7-4 to confirm the proposal is submitted, no required modifications, implementation to proceed. The margin was narrower than before, but it held. Afterward, in the corridor outside the committee room, Patricia Osei stopped him. She was 60, brisk, spoke in short, complete sentences that arrived without preamble. The woman, she said. The caregiver. Is she worth it? Landon considered the question carefully. She'd be offended by the framing, he said. She's worth a lot of things, but she's not the reason I built the proposal. Patricia looked at him. But she's the reason you understand it, she said. Yes, he said. She is. Patricia nodded once. Good, she said. Leadership that understands what it's deciding about is less common than it should be. She walked away. He stood in the corridor and took a breath. He'd won again, narrowly, with cost. He had 4 people on that committee who had voted against him and who would continue to watch his decisions with the sharpened attention of people who had tried to redirect something and failed. Gerald was going to be difficult for months. Ashworth was going to remain a variable. He was also going to go home that evening to a 7-year-old who had an opinion about beetles and a name she'd given a stuffed elephant and an entire particular sense of the world that she was assembling, piece by piece, in the particular way children assembled things, through questions and time and whatever they were shown about how adults handled difficulty. He pulled out his phone. He sent Sophie one text. The review passed. Programs stay. He put the phone back without waiting for a response. Then he took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the November cold, where the city was gray and moving and indifferent, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets. His phone buzzed. Sophie. I know, she wrote. Linda told me an hour ago. She cried again. A pause, then, so did I, just so you know. He looked at the text for a moment. The gray sky above the buildings, the lake, somewhere behind them, going on in its particular enormous way. He wrote back, Thank you for telling me. She wrote, Thank you for not making me have to untrust you. He stood on the sidewalk with that for a minute. He didn't ask her what she meant by it. He already knew. Mr. Delgado had told him. He put his phone in his pocket and walked to find Marcus, and the city moved around him, and somewhere across town a woman in a blue uniform was finishing a shift that had started 11 hours ago, and her mother was at home with a neighbor, and she had cried in a break room over something she'd stopped letting herself hope for, and she'd dried her face and gone back to work because she didn't have the luxury of anything else. He thought, I'm not going to waste this. He didn't know yet exactly what that meant in terms of what came next. He knew it meant something specific and forward-moving and worth the cost of the past 2 months. Marcus pulled up. The car was warm inside. Home? Marcus asked. Home, Landon said. He looked out the window as they drove, at the city doing its enormous ordinary work, and he felt, underneath the exhaustion and the relief and the complicated weight of the day, something else. Something that had been building quietly, the way good things often built, without announcement, without drama, through the simple accumulation of being shown, repeatedly and without performance, that someone was exactly who they appeared to be. He felt, for the first time in a long time, like something was beginning rather than continuing. He held on to that, all the way home. December arrived the way December arrived in Chicago, without apology, with wind that had opinions, with a quality of cold that was less a temperature than a disposition. The city shifted its posture. Coats got heavier. Commutes got longer. People moved with the particular purposefulness of urban residents who had accepted winter as a personal adversary and were not going to let it win without a fight. Landon noticed the cold the way he noticed most things these days, with an awareness that had become more specific, more textured since October. He'd always lived in the city. He'd always known the seasons. But there was something about the past 2 months that had recalibrated his attention to ordinary things in a way he would have found difficult to explain to anyone who asked. The cold, for instance. He noticed it now because Sophie had mentioned, in passing, that the walk from the Maplewood parking lot to the building entrance was 200 feet of exposed concrete with no wind barrier, and that the overnight staff arrived at 5:30 in the morning, and by January it was genuinely brutal. She'd said it without complaint. She'd said it because he'd asked about the facility's physical plant, and she'd answered honestly. He'd sent a memo to the facilities team about exterior windbreak installations at 5 locations the following Monday. He did not tell Sophie he'd done this. He was learning slowly the difference between doing things for Sophie and doing things because Sophie had given him the information to understand they needed doing. The distinction mattered to her. It mattered to him, too, once he understood it clearly, because the difference was the difference between a gesture and a change. Sophie called him on the second Thursday of December. She was off shift, home, Margaret asleep. She'd been doing this more often over the past few weeks, calling in the evening, after the day had settled. It wasn't a scheduled thing. It was just a pattern that had developed, the way patterns develop between people who were becoming part of each other's daily architecture without having made a formal decision about it. Mrs. Okafor asked about you today, she said. He was in the kitchen eating reheated soup Rosa had left, and the image of Mrs. Okafor, whom he knew entirely through Sophie's accounts of her margin notes and her book loans and her exacting opinions about emphasis, arriving in conversation as if she were already acquainted with him, was quietly startling. What did she ask? He said. She asked if the man from the site visit was the one I'd been talking to. Sophie paused. I told her yes. She said, and I'm quoting exactly, "He has a trustworthy face, not a handsome face, a trustworthy one. That is more useful." Landon laughed. He set down his spoon. "I like her very much." "She knows that. It's why she said it." Sophie sounded amused. "She also lent me a new book, James Baldwin, with a note on the first page that says, 'Read this one slowly and more than once. The second time is when it makes sense.'" "Have you read it before?" "Years ago, quickly. I think she knows that." "She probably does," Landon said. They talked for an hour and 15 minutes, which was longer than either of them planned and shorter than either of them noticed. At some point, the conversation moved from Mrs. Okafor to Mia's upcoming winter recital, which was causing Mia significant strategic anxiety because she'd been assigned the triangle, an instrument she considered beneath her investment in the rehearsal process, and she had opinions about this that she'd shared with Landon at length. "She sounds like she should be running something," Sophie said. "She already thinks she is," Landon said. "She reorganized my kitchen cabinet system last week while Rosa wasn't looking. It is, objectively, a better system. I haven't told her that." "Why not?" "Because she's 6 and she needs to understand there's a process for that kind of initiative." Says the man who restructured elder care funding through personal financing because he disagreed with his board. A pause. Then he said, "That's different." "Is it?" He thought about it. "She's going to be insufferable if I tell her the cabinet system works." "She's already insufferable about the Beatles. You managed." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to meet her," he said. Not impulsively, carefully. It had been sitting there for a while, in the place where things sat when you weren't sure of the timing. "Not right away. Whenever you're ready. But I want that." Sophie didn't answer immediately. He heard her settle, the soft sound of someone adjusting their position on a couch, or maybe he imagined the specificity of it. "I want that too," she said. "I'm just..." "Careful," he said. "Yeah." "That's good," he said. "Mia needs careful people in her life. She's had enough of the other kind." He paused. "So have I." Another long silence, but not an uncomfortable one. The kind where something was being absorbed at a pace that required the silence. "After the holidays," Sophie said. "Let's figure something out after the holidays. My mom has a doctor's appointment on the 14th, and then her memory group runs through the 23rd, and I want to get through all of that before adding..." She paused. "Before adding something new that matters. Before adding something new that matters." He held that. "After the holidays," he said. "Yeah." "Okay. Okay." And there it was again, in yet another register. This one meaning, I'm in this, just at my own pace. December moved the way December moved, faster than expected, crowded with the particular fullness of a month that demanded presence at every turn. Mia's recital happened on the 18th, and she played the triangle with the focused intensity of someone who had decided if she was going to do a thing, she was going to do it definitively. She hit every cue. She did not look pleased about it after, but she accepted Landon's hug with good grace and told him that next year she was going to ask for the xylophone. Margaret had a good stretch in December, several consecutive good days where she was primarily herself, present, sharp, making the particular dry jokes she'd apparently always made that Sophie said were her father's inheritance as much as her cheekbones. Sophie told Landon about these days with a careful gratitude, the gratitude of someone who had learned not to expect consistency, but who allowed herself to appreciate it when it came. On December 22nd, Sophie called him from her car in the Maplewood parking lot. She'd just finished a shift, and it was too cold to stand outside, and she was warming up the engine, and said, "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about." "Okay," he said. He was in his office, late, the building mostly empty, the city lights doing their winter thing outside the window. "The night you walked over to me in that parking lot," she said, "I had already decided I was just going to go home. I'd already written it off, the whole evening, the whole idea of trying." She paused. "I had this thought, standing there, that this was just what it was, that my life was what it was, and I should stop pretending some version of it had room for things like bad dates that might become good ones, for trying." What changed your mind? He said. You knocked on the door without knowing you were knocking, she said. You just walked over and asked if I was all right with absolutely no game to it, no smoothness. You said you were aware of how it sounded. That was what got me. She was quiet for a second. Most people don't lead with awareness of how they sound. They just sound how they sound and let you deal with it. He remembered the parking lot, the rain, the particular awkwardness of a 6'1" man in an expensive coat trying to communicate benign intentions. I didn't have a plan, he said. I know, that was the thing. He sat with this for a moment. Outside his window, Chicago was doing its late-night thing. Less traffic, more quiet. The lake invisible in the dark, but present the way the lake was always present, as a weight of water and air at the edge of everything. Sophie, he said. Yeah. I'm in this, he said. I want you to know that clearly, not as a speech, just as a fact you should have. A breath. I know, she said. Good. I'm in it too, she said. I know, he said. We've established you're careful. It's a feature, she said. I know that too, he said. She laughed, quietly, in her cold car in the Maplewood parking lot, and he sat in his office 22 floors above the city and listened to it, and it was, he thought, one of the better moments of a year that had had some genuinely good ones. The community healthcare event was in March. It was organized by the Chicago Regional Health Coalition, an industry body that Landon had been involved with for years. And the theme this year was, with the particular earnestness of such things, care without compromise. The event occupied 2 floors of a convention center downtown and was attended by facility administrators, healthcare workers, policy people, nonprofit directors, a smattering of elected officials who showed up early for the photo opportunity and left before the breakout sessions. Landon was on the program as a speaker. He was talking about the restructuring model, not personally, but as a case study in sustainable care program finance. The deck had been built by Jordan, refined by Claire, reviewed by Martin with the specific concern of a man who had spent months managing the narrative around Hayes Medical, and was determined that this public appearance land correctly. It landed correctly because Landon spoke from the data and didn't try to make it more than it was. He stood at the podium and talked about 4,100 people in a billing reform model and a 22-month projection that was now, 4 months in, tracking slightly ahead of schedule. He talked about what community impact assessment actually looked like when you built it from the facility level up rather than from the spreadsheet down. He did not make it personal. He did not mention the parking lot or the park at midnight or the oatmeal. He did not need to. The room understood from the substance of it that someone had been paying attention in a way that went past the numbers. Sophie had not planned to attend the event. She had mentioned it to Landon in passing in February when she saw the registration notice come through the Maplewood staff email. Linda was sending a small team to the breakout sessions on caregiver retention and facility compliance. Sophie wasn't on the list. She had a Saturday shift. The Saturday shift got covered. A colleague named Danny, who had been at Maplewood for 2 years and with whom Sophie had the particular friendship of people who worked hard in the same difficult place, offered to swap without being asked. Just go, Danny said. You haven't had a Saturday off since October. I had one in November, Sophie said. The farmer's market one doesn't count, Danny said. That was still a mission. You brought apples home for your mom. Sophie had not told Danny everything. She'd told her enough. Danny was the kind of person who accepted enough and didn't push for everything, which was exactly why Sophie had told her enough. She registered for the event the night of the swap. She hadn't told Landon she was going. She almost did, twice. Once by text, which she started and deleted. Once by phone, which she considered and didn't initiate. She examined why she hadn't told him and arrived, honestly, at the fact that she wanted to see him in his world before she was seen in it. She wanted to watch him from the outside, the professional version, the public version, the person who gave speeches at industry events and had his name on things, and see if that person was the same person who had stood in a parking lot with no umbrella asking if she was all right. She arrived at the convention center at 9:15. She got a badge and a program and a cup of conference coffee that confirmed some things were universal regardless of funding level. She went to the first breakout session, the caregiver retention one, and sat in the back and took notes, because she was there for the content too, genuinely, and because she was good at doing two things at once. At 11:30, she drifted toward the main hall for the keynote portion. She found a seat on the aisle, third row from the back, and she watched the program. She watched two speakers she didn't know. She watched a panel discussion about Medicaid policy that was substantive and mildly depressing. She watched a facilities director from Milwaukee give a presentation about staff scheduling software that was more interesting than it had any right to be. And then Landon walked to the podium. She had seen him in a suit. She had seen him in the board meeting context through the lens of the news coverage. She had seen him in the narrow coffee place with his jacket on and his attention entirely on her. She had seen him in his kitchen on a video call once, in jeans, with Mia appearing briefly in the background to announce something important about a caterpillar before being redirected. She had not seen him in a room like this, doing what he actually did. He was good at it. That was the first thing she noted, with the honest objectivity of someone trying to see clearly. He wasn't a performer. He didn't have the oiled charisma of people who spent a lot of time behind podiums. He was direct and specific, and occasionally almost blunt, and when he said a number, he said what the number meant before anyone could decide what it meant for themselves. He used the phrase, "these are people," 3 times in 20 minutes, each time in a context that made it impossible to treat it as rhetorical. She thought, he's the same. That was the thing she'd come to find out, the thing she'd been circling for months without saying its name directly. She'd needed to know if the man who drove through the city at midnight to help find her mother was the same man who stood in front of an industry audience and talked about eldercare funding. If the person who listened to her talk about Mr. Delgado's stopwatch was the same person who'd built a financial proposal around the fact that the stopwatch mattered. He was the same. It shouldn't have been surprising. It was. She realized, sitting in the third row from the back of a convention center in March, that she had been holding something at a measured distance for 5 months. Not because she didn't trust him. She did trust him. More than she'd planned to, more than she was comfortable with at first. She'd been holding it at a measured distance because of the weight of it. Because trust, for her, had a cost attached to it from enough experiences that she'd learned to be strategic with it. She'd been strategic. She'd been careful. She'd taken her time and she'd watched him. And she'd let the evidence accumulate rather than the feeling rush, because she'd learned that feelings rush toward things that weren't always worth the rushing. The evidence had accumulated. After the keynote, she stayed in her seat while the room moved and shuffled and broke into the corridor conversation that followed. She was thinking about whether to find him, or wait, or simply go home and call him tonight and tell him she'd been there. Each option had its own shape. Each one led somewhere different. She was still deciding when she felt the particular shift in a room's attention that sometimes preceded a person entering it, or in this case, crossing it. He saw her from 30 feet away. She knew, when he stopped mid-step, mid-conversation with someone who had been saying something to him that she had just made irrelevant, that he hadn't known she was there. His face did something she didn't have the vocabulary for exactly. Surprise, yes, but under it something else. Something that looked like the particular relief of a person who has been waiting for something without being able to name what they were waiting for. He said something brief to the person beside him, an apology or an excuse or something, and crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said. "No," she said. "Why?" She looked at him honestly. "I wanted to see you in your world before I was in it," she said. "I needed to know if you were the same person." He was quiet for a moment. "And?" "You're the same person," she said. Something in his face settled. Not relief, exactly. More like the resolution of something that had been held in tension for a long time. They stood in the middle of a thinning convention hall, surrounded by the residual noise of an industry event wrapping into its lunch break, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I've been thinking," Sophie said. "About what?" "About what I want." She said it directly, the way she said most things. Which is, I want this. I want to stop being careful about whether I want it, because I've been careful for 5 months, and it hasn't changed anything. I still want it. Landon looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Then, Was that anticlimactic? No, he said. That was exactly right. She almost smiled. I thought there'd be more. Declaration. On my part. You just told me what you want without framing it as a question that required my approval, he said. That's not underdramatic. That's you. She looked at him for a moment. You're getting better at reading me. I've been paying attention, he said. I noticed. Around them, the hall continued to do its thing, the ambient sounds of people and purpose, and the ordinary machinery of a professional gathering. Neither of them was paying it particular attention. Dinner, he said. Tonight. Not a conference dinner, not a work conversation, not a planning session for anything, just dinner. My mom, Mrs. Yuen, he said. She looked at him. How do you know about Mrs. Yuen's Tuesday schedule? You mentioned it in October, he said. The night we found your mother, you said she watched Margaret on Tuesday evenings. Sophie stared at him. That was 5 months ago. I know. She shook her head slowly. Something was happening in her expression that moved through several things before arriving at something quieter and more certain than any of them. You remember that? I remember a lot of things, he said. You talk about your life and I listen. A pause. That's generally how I've always worked. She was quiet for a moment. It's Tuesday, she said. I know. Mrs. Yuen usually comes at 6. I know. She looked at him for one more moment. The particular looking she did, the assessing, the measuring, the taking in of information without the performance of receiving it. He stood in front of her and let her look because he understood by now that this was how she arrived at things. Not through impulse, through consideration, through the careful accumulation of evidence and the honest acknowledgement of what the evidence suggested. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Harlow's, she said. Harlow's, he said. They left the convention center in the early afternoon, not together. She had the last breakout session she'd actually come for. He had 2 conversations he needed to have with coalition members before leaving. They went their separate ways inside the building with the ease of people who had become comfortable with the rhythm of each other's lives, the way those lives sometimes ran alongside rather than together, and who had made peace with that being not a lack, but a structure. He texted her at 2:15. Diane is going to think we're irregular. She wrote back, We've been twice. He wrote, That's regular for Harlow's. She sent back a single punctuation mark, a period, which he had learned over 5 months of her particular text economy meant she was smiling but wasn't going to say so. He put his phone away and finished his conversation with the Milwaukee facilities director, who turned out to have a lot of intelligent things to say about scheduling software that Landon found himself genuinely engaged by, and the afternoon moved. He picked Mia up from his mother-in-law, Ruth's house, at 4 o'clock. Ruth was Elena's mother, a small, precise woman of 71 who had managed her grief over her daughter's death with the same practical resilience that Elena had apparently inherited from her, and who had been an essential, non-negotiable presence in Mia's life since birth. She greeted Landon at the door with the warmth of a woman who had decided years ago that Landon's relationship with her granddaughter was the thing that mattered and who supported it without condition. Mia was at the kitchen table with a book about sea turtles, which represented, apparently, a temporary détente with non-beetle marine life. She looked up when Landon came in, assessed the situation with her dark eyes, and said, You're happy. Am I? He said. You look different, she said. Not accusatory, observational. Ruth, behind him, made a quiet sound that might have been amusement and excused herself to the kitchen. Landon sat down across from Mia. How was your day? He said. Good. Grandma Ruth and I made soup. Sea turtles can live to 100. She looked at him. Did something happen at your work thing? A couple things, he said. Good things. The program things? She knew about the programs in the broad, simplified version he'd given her in December, that his company helped places that looked after older people who needed help, and that people had been trying to stop that, and that he'd been working to make sure they didn't. Mia had thought about this carefully, and then said that he should absolutely not let them stop it because older people had already done all the work of being alive for a long time and didn't need more problems. Yeah, he said. The program things are going well. Good, she said. Is it also the Sophie thing? He looked at her. What do you know about the Sophie thing? I know her name is Sophie, and she looks after old people, and she's your friend, Mia said, with the composure of a child who had assembled information from available sources and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I heard you say her name on the phone a lot, and Grandma Ruth said you seem like yourself again. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to have dinner with her tonight, he said, at a restaurant, just the two of us. Mia considered this. She looked back at her book and turned a page. Is she nice? Yes, he said. She's very good at her job, and she's funny, and she doesn't pretend things are easier than they are. Mia nodded slowly. Those are good things, she said. Then, is she nice to you? He thought about oatmeal timed exactly right. Margin notes in pencil so thin they could be erased. A woman on her knees in a wet park keeping her voice steady so someone else could be calm. He thought about thank you for not making me have to untrust you. He thought about a period at the end of a text message that meant smiling. Yeah, he said. She's nice to me. Mia turned another page. Okay, she said. Can we have the leftover soup before you go? We absolutely can, he said. They had soup at Ruth's kitchen table, the three of them, while Mia explained what she'd learned about sea turtle navigation. They used the Earth's magnetic field, she said, like a map they were born with. And Ruth listened with the genuine attention of a grandmother who understood that the content was secondary to the fact of being listened to. And Landon ate his soup and watched his daughter, and thought about how much of life was exactly this, ordinary and warm and unremarkable and irreplaceable. He got to Harlow's at 7:10. Sophie was already there. She was in the same corner booth. Landon suspected Diane had made this happen, and she had her jacket off and both hands around a water glass, and she was reading something on her phone with the focused attention she gave to most things. She looked up when he walked in. She had changed out of the conference clothes. She was wearing a dark sweater, her hair down, and she looked like herself in the way that she always looked like herself, without performance, without the particular awareness of being looked at that some people carried. She just occupied the space she was in. You're 10 minutes late, she said. Traffic on Michigan, he said. I'm sorry. I ordered bread, she said. Don't make it weird. He sat down. Diane appeared almost immediately with water and the particular satisfaction of a woman who had watched something develop in a restaurant over 5 months and was privately pleased. Welcome back, Diane said. Thank you, Sophie said. The special tonight is the salmon, Diane said to Landon, but she already knows what she's ordering. I do, Sophie confirmed. Diane left them to it. The restaurant was busy enough to have a pleasant noise, but not so busy that it required effort to hear each other. It was March, and cold outside and warm in here, and the lighting was still not aggressive, and the leather booth was still worn soft. They ordered, they ate, they talked. They talked about the event. Sophie told him what had happened in the caregiver retention breakout, which was substantive and concerning in specific ways that she described with the precision of someone who lived inside the issue rather than managing it from the outside. He listened without interrupting. He asked one question, then another, and she answered them honestly and asked one back. And the conversation moved the way their conversations always moved, without agenda, finding its own level. She told him about a new development with her mother, a clinical trial at Northwestern, a memory support program that Margaret's neurologist had referred her to. Early stages, uncertain outcomes, but worth pursuing. Sophie had spent 3 evenings reading through the documentation. I didn't understand half of it, she said. I understood more than I expected. I made Linda's husband explain the parts I didn't. He's a pharmacist. She made him available. She said this with the dry practicality of someone who used every resource in her actual network. How do you feel about it? He asked. Cautiously something, she said. Not hopeful. That's too much. Cautiously, she thought about it. Cautiously open. That's good, he said. It's honest, she said. Which I prefer. He nodded. He had learned over 5 months that Sophie didn't want her difficult things reframed toward optimism. She wanted them acknowledged and sat with, and then, if she asked for perspective, offered perspective. She rarely asked, which meant she had good perspective of her own. He tried to match her in this. After the plates were cleared, after the second coffee had been poured, Sophie was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. The corner booth held them in its worn leather pocket. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Always," he said. "I called my mom before I left tonight," she said. "She was having a good hour. She knew who I was. She knew what day it was. She knew I was going to dinner." Sophie looked at her coffee cup. "She asked who with. I told her a friend named Landon. She asked what he did. I said healthcare. She said—" Sophie paused, a breath that was not quite even. She said, "Is he good to you?" Landon was quiet. "And I said yes," Sophie said, without hesitation. First time I've said something like that about someone without needing to think about it first. He looked at her. She was looking at the table, and then she looked up, and her eyes were slightly bright, which was the closest he'd ever seen her come to crying in front of him, which was significant given everything he knew about how carefully she managed that. She said that was what mattered, Sophie said, and then she asked if we were having Italian because she was in the mood for Italian, and I said I wasn't sure yet, and she said to get the pasta. A small, uneven smile. She's not always there, but when she is, she's still herself. "Yeah," Landon said. "I'm telling you that because—" She stopped, found the thread. "Because I've been carrying a lot of things alone for a long time by choice and by necessity, and I'm not very good at letting people in to where the actual weight is. And I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better at that. With you." She said it precisely, without dramatizing it. "I'm working on it." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked at it for a second. Then she turned her hand over and held his back, with the firm grip he'd known since the parking lot, the grip of a woman who did things deliberately or not at all. "I know you are," he said. "It's slow," she said. "I know." "You're patient," she said. "That's—" She paused. "That's not nothing. For me." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant lights, the worn booth, the second cup of coffee, the March night outside the rain-dark windows. "Landon," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad you had no umbrella," she said. He didn't quite understand for a second. Then he did. The parking lot. The rain. No umbrella, which had been careless and accidental and apparently, according to Sophie, the thing that had tipped some invisible scale in his favor. The absence of an umbrella as a form of honesty. "Me too," he said. She smiled. A real one. The full laugh-adjacent smile, the one that changed her face completely. He'd been storing them since the first one. "Get the check," she said. "I want to walk." "It's 32 degrees," he said. "I know, I have a coat." She was already reaching for her jacket. They walked. Down Collier Street, the same street Marcus had driven him down in October when he hadn't meant to stop anywhere. The same bare trees, the same lit storefronts, the same city moving around them in the cold dark. Sophie walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds and her shoulder occasionally close enough to his that it would have been easy, natural, to close the remaining distance between them. At the corner of Collier and Marsh, the same corner, the same traffic light, Sophie stopped. He stopped beside her. She looked at the restaurant across the street. Bianchi's with the striped green awning and the Tuesday night prefix sign that had been updated to Thursday. The parking lot was lit and ordinary and completely unremarkable. "Right there," she said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at the parking lot for a moment. He didn't know exactly what she was seeing, herself in October probably, with the dead phone call and the worn uniform, and the decision she'd already made to write off the evening, the particular geometry of before. "Different now," she said. "Very different," he said. She turned. She looked at him in the cold March light, her cheeks pink from the temperature and her eyes clear and steady. "You're going to meet my mother," she said, "properly. Not in a crisis. A regular visit. When she's having a good day." She said it like she was settling something. "I want her to meet you when she can actually know she met you, so she can remember it." "I'd like that," he said. "And Mia," she said, "after the holidays became after New Year's, became after I figure it out. And I think I've figured it out enough." I want to meet her. She looked at him. Kids can tell things. She'll probably tell me what to think about you in the first 10 minutes. She'll tell you about beetles, he said, and then she'll give you her assessment based on how you receive the beetle information. I'll receive it well, Sophie said. I like beetles. You don't like beetles. I'll learn to like beetles. She paused. For the important things, I'm adaptable. He looked at her. The corner, the cold, the light from the traffic signal turning from red to green to red again because no one was crossing. The city going on at the edges of them, indifferent and enormous, the way cities always were. He thought about the parking lot, about the decision to park the car, which he hadn't decided so much as simply done. The way you did things that you hadn't planned because something in you recognized that the planned route was wrong. He thought about Marcus watching him in the rear view and not moving when the light turned green, and about whether that had been Marcus's decision or its own. He thought about 4,100 people behind a spreadsheet row, and a woman who had given them faces by simply describing her Tuesday. He thought about what his daughter had said at the kitchen table 4 months ago with a sea turtle book open in front of her. Is she nice to you? And how quickly he'd known the answer. He thought about the things that didn't announce themselves, the things that arrived like rain that got through your collar before you noticed, quietly, coldly, changing the temperature of everything without making a scene about it. Sophie, he said. Yeah. I'm in this, he said. Not the same as when he'd said it in December. This time it meant something more specific, more forward, more committed to a direction rather than simply a present state. Completely. For as long as you'll have me in it. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that a car turned the corner and moved past them, and the traffic light cycled twice. That's a lot, she said. I know. I might need you to say it again in 6 months. I'll say it in 6 months, he said. And after that. She nodded slowly. Then she stepped forward and closed the distance between them. Not dramatically, not like a scene, just simply the way she did things. And when he put his arms around her, she leaned into it with the particular quality of someone who had finally, after a long time carrying things alone, decided to set something down. They stood on the corner of Collier and Marsh in 32-degree March weather, and the city moved around them without caring at all, and the traffic light cycled through its colors, and somewhere across town Mr. Delgado's stopwatch was probably on his nightstand, and Mrs. Okafor's pencil was probably marking something in a margin, and Margaret Bennett was probably asleep in her apartment with an old photograph somewhere nearby, and Mia was at Ruth's house already asleep with 3 stuffed animals in a specific order that only she understood, and the lake was out there in the dark doing what the lake did. None of it was neat. None of it was resolved in the clean way of things that didn't have ongoing costs. The programs were funded for 3 years, and after 3 years there would be another fight. Margaret's trial was cautiously open. Gerald Whitmore was still difficult and would continue to be. Sophie still had 3 evenings a month that didn't belong to someone else. Mia was going to ask the beetle question, and Sophie was going to have to genuinely learn to receive beetle information, and that was going to be a whole thing. But there was this. 2 people standing on a corner in the cold, having found each other in a parking lot by accident, or by the kind of decision that gets made below the level of deciding, and having, through 5 months of being honest about what they needed, and patient with what they couldn't rush and stubborn about what was worth fighting for, arrived somewhere true. Not perfect. True. Which was, in the end, the only version of anything that lasted. The light turned green. They stayed on the corner a moment longer. Then they walked.